Derrick Broze is a freelance investigative journalist, author, documentary filmmaker, and activist. He is the founder of the Conscious Resistance Network, an independent media outlet focused on hard-hitting investigative journalism. Derrick is the writer, director, and narrator of The Pyramid of Power, a 17-part docuseries focused on answering the question, who runs the world? He is also the author of the underground bestseller, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, and the Conscious Resistance Trilogy. Derrick is also the co-founder of the Freedom Cell Network and the People's Reset Movement, formerly known as the Greater Reset. He is also the lead writer at The Last American Vagabond. And man, we've had our differences, but I feel like this is a conversation that we can absolutely unite on. And I think it's an incredibly important conversation considering the state of the world, the state of the so-called freedom movement, and what is happening right now just after this episode releases. So thanks for being with me, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So the first topic I want to dive right into, I'll link in the show notes, your background and everything like that, and links so people can look into you a little bit more, knowing that we have 2 hours, which may seem like a lot of time, but for some reason my episodes tend to go like 3. So I want to just dive right in. This idea that Trump is fighting for freedom. And for a lot of people who are listeners of this podcast, I've shared my opinions quite a bit, but maybe this is an episode that will help just reiterate and sort of reframe everything that's going on, because we can sort of get lost in the sauce, so to speak, with everything that's happening, especially because Kamala Harris, Biden, the whole leftist paradigm is becoming increasingly tyrannical, like absurdly tyrannical and absurdly delusional, obviously. So there seems to be sort of this artificially constructed Overton window that keeps shifting towards tyranny, where now, if you compare the sentiments of Ron Paul from 2010 through 2012, where he was openly, publicly discussing the idea of completely ending the Federal Reserve, of disbanding several 3-letter agencies, of completely eliminating government corruption from corporations and other, banking interests, et cetera, openly discussing that. What Trump says now seems to be like almost tyrannical in comparison to what Ron Paul was saying in 2010, 2012. And that's how much this Overton window has sort of shifted. Like the accepted discourse, or the most common discourse in society, has shifted so much towards tyranny that now what Trump says and what Trump does, or what Trump fails to do and promises that he was going to do, seems to be very freedom oriented, again, relative to Kamala Harris. So I just wanted to turn it over to you, because I know you've done incredible research in not exposing conjecture, not exposing your own opinion, although you do give your own opinion as it relates to Trump and things like this, and I do too. But overwhelmingly, what you're exposing is verifiable factual information that would indicate that Trump and those who back him are so far away from, quote, freedom-oriented and health-oriented that I don't see how anyone could possibly support him. So I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of bounce off of what I just said.
No, I mean, as you're going over that, I'm just reflecting on how important this conversation is right now. I mean, I've been just this morning, the last couple of days, really posting. Obviously, we're coming up to the selection very soon. So this is like, and early voting has already began. So people are kind of already doing their part in that whole scheme. But it's, to me, the reason it matters to me is because of the specific part that you mentioned about like the broader freedom movement, however we want to label that: health, freedom, truther movement, conspiracy, whatever, all those sort of overlapping different movements that are generally seeking truth. And how many different variants of that have fallen for this psychological operation to support Trump. And you see it, as I'm sure I see it, as I'm sure you have, in the spiritual movement, in the yoga community, obviously QAnon type things. Like, there's so many different variants of people who have fallen for this idea that one way or the other, Trump is something more than he really is. And I think it's honestly one of the most powerful like propaganda operations I've seen. I mean, I've only been doing this 15 years, but I've definitely feel like I've never, and I've been asking friends recently, including I got to interview David Icke and asked him, like, have you ever seen something like to this level? And it seems like, there's a somewhat of a consensus between those of us who've taken a step back and still have our critical thinking skills of like, this is something we've never seen. You were kind of outlining that pretty perfectly as far as like the Overton window. I've said for a while now that I think a big part of this operation is to make the left, and I say that broadly speaking, because I know people who are leftists who are like, I have nothing to do with that. These people aren't real leftists. As far as they're concerned, they're actually conservatives. Like
Right.
the left and right
Like
is
the
so messed up.
traditional liberal, essentially.
Exactly.
Right.
So there are people who look at that and they're like, I don't align with that. But broadly speaking, the American Democratic Party, progressive movement, etc., which does go to other Western nations as well. As you said, I mean, they've gone insane when it comes to gender ideology, when it comes to supporting censorship, when it comes to all the stuff we saw during COVID 1984. So anybody with a brain can see that. And then there are some people who are still kind of stuck, I think, in this lower level binary thinking of, well, obviously these people are bad, so then the answer must be the other side. And really, when things have sunk to such a low bar, it's not that hard to look good. You just got to, like Trump. I mean, Trump, like you kind of mentioned Ron Paul. I was actually sharing this recently. When you go back and look at some of Ron Paul's speeches or other influential and intelligent, powerful speakers, and then listen to a Trump speech, like there's nothing there. I mean, he has no substance, nothing. So he's not really inspiring people based on principles, deeply held values or anything. It's just that he's saying he's going to be better than the other side. And at this point, people are willing to accept that. So as I'm battling people mainly on Twitter, because of course, because of Elon Musk, it's become like Trump Central. Some of them will even acknowledge, okay, yes, he's funded by the Zionist lobby. Okay, he's being supported by steering committee members of the Bilderberg Group, but at least he's not her. Or it's going to slow things down. I mean, there's any number of what I would say are excuses that we could go over, like it's going to be a little bit slower. And I guess there's some pragmatic argument for that, but you're still participating in this immoral system. If it's not him, it's going to be communism. And that's the other big aspect is they are increasingly, and when I say they, I mean, we could get into that, but the predator class broadly is what I usually call them. They are making it where every election is being spoken about, and of course the media plays their role, and politicians is being spoken about in apocalyptic terms, right? So this is like, it's either like we stop Trump and we're going to go full on to fascism and authoritarianism, which I do think Trump is an authoritarian, and the evidence, as you were saying, I mean, it's there. Like, well, we can talk about that. We can actually break that down. And then the other side says if she wins, it's full on communism. This is going to be the end of free speech. They're going to round us all up. And perhaps, I mean, ultimately, they both march things towards that direction. There's some differences, when it comes to abortion or immigration or some of these issues that, not to say they don't matter, they obviously do matter. But at the end of the day, they both still are passing that baton back and forth. Like the big thing right now is people are saying the Biden administration, they have a DOD directive talking about being able to authorize lethal force against Americans. This has been going around recently. And so some of the Trump supporters are saying, like, this is a clear sign that Biden and Harris are authoritarians. This is why we need Trump. But what they don't understand is that it passes from one administration, one party to the next. So Bush installs surveillance and gets that passed after 9/11. Well, then Obama comes in, he says he's going to investigate him, but instead he uses it, right? He becomes the drone king. Then he does the NDA 2011, which allows indefinite detention of American citizens. Then Trump comes in, and it goes back and forth. So it's not even that Trump's necessarily going to use that DOD directive, or maybe even Harris. But the point is, somebody will. They've put all the pieces in place, both parties, over decades, and Trump is no different, that will allow an authoritarian, whether it does end up being Trump or Harris or somebody else in the future, to come along and absolutely turn the U.S. into a total police state. I mean, there's no denying that Trump has played a role in advancing that agenda.
Yeah, I completely agree. Very well said on that, man. And the sentiments that seem to be shared amongst people, and I'll give for an example, Operation Warp Speed, right? There are so many different camps in the quote larger freedom movement. Again, I don't even know what to call it at this point. Truth, freedom, health, it's all pointed towards the same direction, as you said. Completely agree with that. On what happened between 2016 and 2020. There's one camp that'll say, okay, Trump subverted the deep state to get elected, but then Trump was tricked by all of the people on his cabinet to do what he did with Operation Warp Speed and things like this, which indicates to me that he's not really as brilliant as people claim that he is. And then the other side of that is the possibility that, okay, Trump subverted the deep state to get elected, but then the deep state forced his hand to do things that he didn't want to do, which would indicate to me that he's not actually as powerful as people in anti-deep state as people claim that he is. But he'll get right back in there. Just you watch in 2024.
47 is going to be different.
Yeah, 47 is going to be different this time. And I just look at the evidence of what happened between 2016 and 2020 that, in my opinion, and I can only state my opinion, and I would imagine you largely share the same views, and I'd love to get into some of the evidence that exists that Trump is clearly anti-freedom. I know you touched on it a little bit, but in my opinion, the evidence points to that Trump was either doing this deliberately or he's making these very big empty promises that he knows are not going to be able to come true. But that, I guess the best way to put it is that people are just captured into this ideology of giving him so many excuses because of the sentiments that he shares. But I'd love to pass it to you just to riff on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's good to be able to look at those different perspectives like you were just doing. And this is how I try to operate at different times, because it's important for us to consider, obviously, other perspectives. And this points to a bigger problem that I've been noticing. It's not a new problem, but it does seem to, I can see the full effect of it now, I'll say. And that is that the internet fracturing off and people increasingly going into silos.
Yeah.
There is some truth in the corporate mainstream reporting talking about, oh, this is what they say about conspiracy theorists, is that, we break off into these little silos and we just go into echo chambers. It's absolutely true. And so many people who are awake and in these truth freedom movements, once they develop whatever their set of basic opinions are, they just listen to podcasts who tell them that same thing over and over all the time. And so if you find yourself in a silo of pro-Trump media, whether you're on Rumble or you're on Twitter or whatever, you pretty much largely, not everybody, but largely tune out all the other stuff. Right. Anything bad they say about Trump is just mainstream. That's TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. Like, they have these things already ready to go.
And vice versa too.
Oh yeah, it works across the board. Right. Like, this is just something that we all need to be careful of. And confirmation bias, I know these are things you've spoken about. Like, this is, of course, it's a bigger problem than just dealing with the Trump people, but it's absolutely happening. And so, just as one example, like just in the last couple of days, it's the latest things that's coming out from the Atlantic and from the New York Times, which are both like outlets we should be skeptical of and shouldn't just blindly trust. But again, I've noticed that people, because of the purposeful, and I think this was done by on purpose in operation, the purposeful constant lying about Trump, Russia, this and that, it sort of made a bunch of people immune to anything that comes from the corporate media. And they have this incorrect and I think not objective view that anything from corporate media must be false. Mm-hmm. So, we could show them something documented. It could be a CNN article quoting something Trump said. I could have the video too, but if it came from CNN, because of all the horrible things that they have done, which we should call out, right, but it might be the only source you have on that particular topic, a Trump supporter or somebody in denial will just deny that, right? Even if the facts are there, we can confirm them. I think this is really problematic, where we start thinking, I see this in multiple areas. Okay, if something's censored, it must be true. But if it hasn't been taken down, then it surely can't be true because it's not threatening anybody.
Right.
If this person says something bad about the right people, this is how they say with Trump, then he must be on our side because the right people hate Trump. That must mean he's on my team. It's this super low vibrational way of thinking. That's, again, in this binary. Okay, it's not red. Well, then it must be this. It can't be strawberry chocolate or whatever, vanilla. It's like they're still stuck in these. And I think these are different layers of deception that exist. I've talked about this quite a bit, that they're these various layers that we can get trapped in. So if you try to look at these things from as objective as a perspective, you have the outlooks that you mentioned. Trump came in there and he truly did somehow defeat the system and got in there. Nobody expected it, despite how massive this system really is. People on one hand will readily admit that intelligence networks overthrow governments, have pulled off false flags, were involved in Jeffrey Epstein, but somehow us voting got past all the control they have and they got this guy in there who has all these shady connections. And that's one perspective, right? Then, like you said, he got in there and then he was fooled by the deep state and he was powerless. Then on the other hand, you have, okay, well, he had full intentions and then they stifled him at every corner. And then there's more where I lean, and we don't have hard evidence for this either, but that he is absolutely playing a role. I think there is no, in my view, there's no other way to look at it. Of course, you could look at it any other way.
100%.
But when you look at the evidence of that Trump has been not a literal actor, and I don't think that's something to just sort of like, that's not the only piece of evidence, but it's not something to ignore. And in the WWE,
we're creating a canvas here, right?
Like, so yeah, exactly. Like, think about Trump being seated in the media. I do think this is a long game. Like, the other side, the Trump supporters, like, he's been around for a long time. He's QAnon, this and that. He's coming to save the deep state. I think there's something like that going on where Trump is some sort of long game operation. He absolutely has connections to mafia and to the Russians. He does have Russian connections, not in the way that they spun it with the 2016 election, but you go back to the 80s. Also, he was bailed out by Rothschild bankers, Wilbur Ross, who then he put in his administration. That's not something to ignore. He was going into debt and the Rothschild bankers bailed him out. His mentor, Roy Cohn, is a known pedophile. And the obvious decades-long relationship with Epstein that his crowd still tries to downplay and act like, oh, it's just a few pictures. Like, they had a deep relationship that's documented in numerous articles since the 90s, Trump saying he's a great guy. And, I've got a lot of work on that if people want to go, further down that rabbit hole. That's just one piece, right? So you start to look at these different relationships, and that's okay, we should be careful with this guy, right? Then he comes into office in 2016 and immediately starts appointing members of big pharma, of big agriculture, Bilderberg Group members, including the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry. And side note on that, I did this report years ago called "The Silence from InfoWars is Deafening," because I showed an article of 2012 Alex Jones and InfoWars pointing out how Rick Perry, the governor at the time, had gone to the Bilderberg Group and how bad this was. Then going forward to 2016, when Trump appoints him to environmental secretary or whatever, and not a peep from InfoWars about it, right? And a lot of independent media, and this is points to that bigger problem that there's no way they're blind to the things that me, a simple man with a computer, is finding out and looking up. Like, I'm just a one-person team, you know, I'm not extra smart than anybody else. So people are choosing to ignore these things, right? And then you go further into his administration. I have an article titled, "Here are 18 ways that Trump served the deep state." And
we'll link that in the show notes.
Yeah, so I wrote that at the end of his first term. I don't have them all off the top of my head, but just a few of them. He dropped more bombs than Obama, more drone bombs than Obama. People, there's this false meme going around that Trump is an anti-war candidate, and it's absolutely garbage. Like, for one, I mean, just in the last month, they've put out campaign ads saying that they're going to bomb Iran if it means defending Israel. And JD Vance is saying we're going to hit them hard. Like, he's not a peace candidate in any way. Like, sure, there were some moves he'd made if you want to look at him from a beneficial perspective, but overall, he dropped more drone bombs than Obama. He bombed Syria based on the false flag gas attack over there. You know, there's just more and more in that area that we could dive into. I encourage people to see that article. Another one, he put big oil into the White House. And now I'm not some like leftist that hates private business or anything like that and just like against all the corporations for no reason. But for those who understand the bigger picture of Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset, and also understand that the Rockefellers, who were part of the big oil industry, who founded it and created it, they are also, along with other families, part of this drive towards climate change, which I know for some people doesn't make sense. Why would the big oil companies be pushing climate change narrative? Because they are the ones driving the show. It's all about population control. You know, it's a whole bigger topic.
Can I touch on that real quick? Yeah, hold your thought, because you're on a roll right there. I just want to touch on this. Just like the left versus right paradigm is a false dilemma, it's a false dialectic. The same thing can be said about electric, which, like, obviously, like the green agenda, electric, all that is totally nonsensical, fully acknowledge it. But just like that is a false dilemma, electric versus oil is also a false dilemma, because we know that there's free energy technology available that the government suppresses. So just wanted to touch on that. That's
important to point those out. I've got actually like a running list in one of my folders of these kinds of things that I see, these extremes. They want us to argue in extremes when the answer is usually above and beyond these things. Yeah, and so, you know, to that point, the point I was making about the climate agenda and the importance of big oil. I mean, in my article I show, and this is not something that I'm the exclusive person reporting. This is out there for people who want to find. Again, if you get out of your silo, if you start listening to something different than just pro whatever your view is, which is important, then you learn that Trump put big oil executives, like literally in the White House. There was a secret recording that was leaked where they were going on about how much access. They'd never had as much access as they had under the Trump administration. And again, that's not like a climate narrative perspective saying like all oil's bad or carbon, et cetera. But to really understand that all these different agencies that we understand are supposed to protect us, the EPA, et cetera, that they've been captured. Trump didn't stop that capturing. He didn't like put an end to it. He continued the same practices. That's my broader point here. And you could go on and on. Of course, this audience is going to be familiar with Operation Warp Speed. Yep. I mean, it was a military operation, and Trump put big pharma execs in there. Myself and Whitney Reb and Ryan at Last American Vagabond were early reporting on this and showing people like, look at this is a military operation that Trump is appointing these people directly with big pharma at the head of it. You know, I think that topic has been covered.
Can I touch on that real quick, though, because people might not be aware of this?
Sure.
So Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner that was appointed by Trump from 2017 through 2019, or sorry, nominated by Trump from 2017 through 2019. He was the FDA commissioner under Trump, right? After 2019, he leaves the FDA. And then 2020 comes around. Scott Gottlieb has joined the board of Pfizer. One thing that people don't realize with that is while he was the commissioner of the FDA, one of the things that he did was to help expedite the approval process for experimental drugs and therapeutics. That is one of the things, the key things that he did from 2017 through 2019 while commissioner of the FDA, nominated by Trump. Again, Scott Gottlieb in 2020 joins Pfizer. And then in 2021, Pfizer has a product expedited in its approval process through Operation Warp Speed, ultimately set up and initiated by Trump, to help expedite the approval process of the very thing that the overwhelming majority of people in the freedom movement recognized was maiming and killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. And the excuses that I hear for that are that, well, Trump was tricked. Again, going back to, well, Trump was tricked and he didn't know any better, which is interesting because if you look back at his tweets in 2014, he was openly discussing the idea that vaccines were problematic and caused autism possibly. And he also was entertaining bringing RFK on for a vaccine safety commission. So you can't say that he was tricked in that instance, or they'll say that, well, he had no choice. If they hadn't locked down, then we would, if they hadn't initiated Operation Warp Speed, then we would be locked down for 7 years. We'd still be locked down right now. That's the other narrative that I hear.
He had to do it to speed up the process, like, and get the vaccines out there.
Right. Which is absolutely absurd, because if anyone on the left had done the exact same thing in the exact same way without anything else changing, it would have been pointing to how unbelievably tyrannical and genocidal that individual is. But because it just so happens to be Trump, and because relative to Kamala Harris and other left-leaning people, and because this somehow Trump has this air, but this false aura of freedom around him, people just overlook that or make endless excuses for something that is slapping you in the face that is so clearly anti-freedom.
Absolutely, man. I mean, we could list off a number of things that would fit in that category where it's like they want to have it both ways. In some cases, he was just innocent and unaware, and so he got fooled. But in other cases, he's all powerful and all knowing, and there's no way that they can stop him. It's like they want to play it both ways. And I think it really comes down to, and I know we'll get into this later, but it really comes down to a lack of principles. I mean, that a lot of people who have woken up, they really don't have any philosophical foundation for their awakening. They're just, which is not, I'm not attacking anybody. It's like I think it's a process, right? I mean, none of us, including the two of us having this conversation, are fully awakened or enlightened or anything like that. It's an ongoing process. And I think so many people woke up the last few years and it was a chaotic time, and they knew, okay, I don't want to be forced to get vaccinated. I don't want to be forced to do this thing or that thing. So they had a reaction. I don't like that, but they haven't spent so much time thinking about what they do want and what is the next stage and what does freedom really mean, and these kind of deeper philosophical questions that I think some of us who have spent more time thinking about this, I don't think the broader movement has kind of had that. So then when somebody like Trump comes along, and again, the bar has been set so low because the other side is acting pretty crazy, all somebody has to do is just be slightly less of a piece of shit, and you know, all of a sudden you're the hero of the day. Right, dude. And you know, again, I see Trump gaining points from people because he'll make a joke, because he'll troll somebody, and again, the bar is just so freaking low that people are not impressed by like a Ron Paul, somebody speaking eloquently or speaking philosophically about, you know, why this is immoral, et cetera. It's just like, oh, ha, ha, look, I'm going to do this thing. And then openly, and I've documented this as well on the consciousresistance.com, there's a whole section called the Trump Deception it's like a collection of all my reports over the last years or so, showing his actions. Again, not just me ranting about, oh, I hate Trump, so somebody can say I have Trump derangement syndrome, but quoting the man directly, you know? And again, people who are in their silos, they don't hear these things. They don't hear the reports from outside of their echo chambers, or if they do, they just dismiss them as those are all deep state agents. I mean, this has been such a powerful psychological operation that they have been able to convince the diehards, at least. I know there are others who are maybe more centrist who are like, yeah, like they're looking around, they're like, okay, well, Trump at least says some good things.
And I can see the defensive voting aspect. That's something I want to touch on. I wouldn't engage in that personally.
Yeah, but I hear people. See an argument. I see people who believe that. I still think it's they're wasting their time, and ultimately, as we'll talk about, like to me, the goal is like, look, even if you think you want to vote, there's so much more you can do. Don't just vote and then sit around and wait for Trump or whoever to come save you. That's my bigger issue, because sometimes people will hear the solutions that I propose and they'll say, well, can't I do that and vote? And sure, yeah, if you want to do that, at least hopefully, if you're going to go play that game, be an informed person. Don't be somebody who is just a cult follower and is like, oh, I'm going to vote straight R or straight D or whatever, you know, just my team, my color, whatever. Because it gets that super base, and it's the base emotions that they play to, the media and the predator class, and the way they can turn us against each other, fighting each other. It's an incredibly insane and powerful, and probably from just a pure psychological standpoint, a beautiful thing to watch, because it's very powerful.
It is. You almost have to give them credit, right?
I mean, no, it's an incredible thing. And I guarantee you that the architects of this are sitting back and are studying, and they see, look, when we play this card, look at the response we get here. Now we know how to make them act that way. I mean, people need to really understand fifth generation warfare, social media as a battlefield, and how these things are operating on us on a daily basis. There is so much of an effort to take you away from being in control of your own mind and your own heart, and pulling you emotionally. And, you know, I'm not immune from this at all. Like when I find myself, I've been getting better at like not responding at all to these sort of things.
We've done it to each other, bro.
Well, it's like, you have something to say, right? And you feel the need to put it out in the world.
Yeah.
But there are times where I am grateful to have putting energy into communicating with people online, because I will get emails and responses later, as I'm sure you have, saying like, hey, this thing you did, this thing you shared, this video, whatever, it did reach me. It took a little while. It's been a couple years, but now, and so that's why I still even bother, like as of today, like still posting, trying to, I'm working on 3 articles right now, actually. One is called Election 2024, Technocrats versus Technocrats. The other one is called 4 Reasons Not to Vote for Kamala Harris, and then 4 Reasons Not to Vote for Donald Trump, which are basically designed to illustrate what we're talking about here, and showing those commonalities that they actually do share. And it's just my effort to try to, not because I'm black pilled. This is the other thing that I keep seeing as well, is that those of us who are calling these things out, we're just negative. We're black pilled. We want to make people hopeless. We're trying to push people towards learned helplessness, when I actually see it the exact opposite.
Dude,
like, this is the white pill to me. This is like the waking up of like, you're actually in control.
Whoa, I'm incredibly powerful as a human being. That's the way that I see this. And I could see where some people are like, oh, we're all fucked. Don't vote because it doesn't matter either way. We're all fucked anyway.
There are people who believe that.
I don't believe that at all. Exactly. Neither you or I believe that. And I know your good friend John Bush, he doesn't believe that either. And the people I engage with, like Mike Winter, who are very much on the same page, they don't believe that. That's not what we're saying at all. I think people misconstrue what we're saying.
That's part of the programming of how deeply we have been conditioned, whether through schooling, through propaganda and the media, everything around us, that this is the only way to change things. Man. So if somebody is telling you, don't participate, don't vote in these systems, then they must be, the mind goes to, okay, so then I'm supposed to be apathetic. I'm just supposed to give up. And that's really another binary that I've been trying to burst through and show people, like, it's not just be apathetic and, just smoke weed and party all day, YOLO, whatever, we just give up. Or you got to be diehard into the system. Like, and I understand that most people also probably don't operate in those extremes, and they are looking for answers. But the most obvious thing that the world around you tells you is that voting is the way to do that.
Well, let's think about the psychology behind that too, like the deeper meaning of what most people are indicating about their own belief systems when they say something like, don't vote, so that means I'm supposed to just give up. That means that, or that would imply to me that they think the only thing that there is to do that is worth doing at all is voting, because if not this, then it must be give up.
Yeah.
If not voting, give up.
And that associate non-voting with just kind of giving up on life and stepping out.
Exactly.
Which for some people it is. I mean, I wish that the beautiful thing, I think, in one hand is that we have millions and hundreds of millions of people who don't vote. Mm-hmm. And so in my mind, I've always kind of seen that is a potential group that, if activated, would be very powerful.
So powerful.
But of course, the more the propaganda goes along, because you've got the millions that vote for this party, and then third party, but still, I might still hold this year, maybe not because they've put the propaganda on so strong, but typically every year, the largest group is actually non-voters. They still can't, with all the propaganda, convince the masses to come out and give a shit. Now, to me, I feel like that's kind of a positive thing, because at least they're not brainwashed one way or the other, hard left, hard right. And I'm not saying all voters are brainwashed, but there are the diehards, right?
Right.
But that group who says, I'm not going to participate either because the choices suck, which is what, you got to remember, till the last 6 months when they forced Kamala again and forced Trump, all of the polls were showing that nobody wanted Trump and Biden again. That there was like people from both parties were like, this is not the race we want. This is why RFK was trying to run in that lane of like, hey, I'm an alternative before he sold out. It's this reality that people wanted something different, right? So we shouldn't forget that all those people are still out there, but now they're just being forced into this binary of, okay, well, I did want different, but this is what we got. So I'm going to play that game. And some people, though, will say, no, I'm not going to play. Like, if this is my choices, I am going to stay home. Now, how do you take that person from being just the person who stayed home, who obviously cares because they're kind of paying attention, or at least they're somewhat paying attention, to being activated and trying to vote and express that vote every day in different ways? That's really where my work tries to come in. And the problem I'm kind of really hyper focused on is that, like, motivating, activating people, because it's hard enough to keep yourself motivated and activated, let alone trying to show people, overcoming everything that we are just discussing, that it's not just apathy or voting, that there are other choices, there are other paths. And not to say that my path is the only path, or anything that we're going to share today is the only path, but the fact is that there are other options. And that is one of the most common refrains I've been seeing, and for the months and weeks leading up to this election and including today. Okay, so for one, it's like, if you're talking crap about Trump, then you must like Harris, right? Obviously, that's like, okay, that's the level of thinking.
I've been called a lefty. I've been.
Yeah, I usually don't even respond
your fourth
to that.
Booster, like,
oh yeah, I'm like, you really don't know who I am, then, do you? But again, it just shows that level of thinking. Somebody sees that and they think it must be the opposite. But then the other thing is people hearing that, oh, you're not voting, so you're just giving up. Or the other thing, I guess, even if we were to have some kind of perfect system, I know we have very similar views on voting in general and the system and the immorality of that. But if we were to have some system that somehow was like fully democratic and everybody's participating, all voices are heard and counted, all that sort of thing, in that situation, ideally, I think what we're supposed to be going for is vote for the person who aligns with your beliefs. But that's not even what people are doing. Even the voters, they're just like, I'm voting against him. I'm voting against her. Not even that I really like what he's saying or what she's saying, or that I even like really know anything about him. I just know that I hate the other person enough that I'm going to go vote. And so they're not even voting for things they care about. Like, I think that also says something about the level of thinking that the country has gone. And I don't know if it was always that way. I'm not saying it was perfect in some time in the past, but it's definitely at that point now where people don't really even like Trump, but they're going to vote for him because they hate the other side or they're worried about the other side, and vice versa. And that, I think, is a sad state of affairs too. It's like you can't even really claim that the people who are voting are fully excited about the situation. Nobody really wanted these candidates. They're voting against things rather than for things. In a system that's already rigged and immoral in all these other ways, with candidates who are both backed by the Zionist lobby and both being funded by steering committee members of the Bilderberg Group. I mean, that's, to me, is it's the peculiarity of our situation, and the fact that we are here, I think, is a sign that I don't want to say they're winning, but if you go back a few years ago, I think it was 2017, one of the public discussion topics for the Bilderberg Group meeting of that year was the post-truth world. And I definitely think that is what we are experiencing now. And that, you know, at the time, and I think this will still play a role, we were sort of thinking, well, they're talking about deep fakes and video and audio fakery, which is pretty much here now, and AI and things like that, which are going to make it very difficult to prove to somebody, if somebody wants to try to screw your life over, that's not you making out with another woman in this video, because it sure looks very real. And that's your voice on this call. And you know, these things are all possible, right? Well, there's that, but then there's also just the chaos of like, people can't tell what's up from down anymore.
Or people refuse to look into anything outside of, quote, their side, meaning that just like you said, even if something on the, quote, other side says something that is objectively true, it's automatically false in their mind just because it's coming from something that is counter to, quote, their side.
You made this point earlier, and I don't think I wanted to just add to it, that if we were to take quotes from Donald Trump, this is a meme I'm working on, so maybe I'll still put it out there and see, because it's kind of like I'm baiting a hook, and I think people will fall for it, which is like taking quotes from Trump and then putting them out there and be like, oh my God, did you guys hear what Biden just said? Wait, never mind, that's actually Donald Trump.
Right.
Because the same thing would be applied if Trump said and did the things that he has done. And, you know, I've been hearing lately, prove to me he's authoritarian. Okay, he hasn't fully gone on authoritarian yet in his first administration, but he's definitely promising retribution. He's definitely wants to have the largest deportation operation ever. And obviously,
well, think about this, even without the deportation operation too. How many times have you spoken out about just the Israeli government, let's say?
Yeah.
Okay, I know I have. I've spoken out about the Israeli government, never said anything about Jewish people, the Israeli government. And how many people referred to you as anti-Semitic just for doing that? So many people. And how many times has Trump indicated that if he is put into office, he will get rid of all the people who are, quote, anti-Semitic? So what does anti-Semitic mean?
He calls people who are, anti-Zionist, pro-Hamas radicals. And that's their way of dehumanizing and associating anybody who supports Palestine, or not even supports Palestine, but is just against these policies, as pro-Hamas radical, which is, what is a Hamas? Designated terrorist group. So what is he calling you, a terrorist? I actually did an article about a week ago called the Republican Party platform under Trump is pro-Israel and anti-free speech. And just going in there, and they literally have said, like, they want to like silence campus protests, people who are pro-Hamas radicals. In addition to the mass deportation operation, more related to immigration, he also says, like, we're going to deport anybody who is pro-Hamas. So there's, you start to look at these different things in addition to like the retribution. If this was being said by Obama, if this was being said by Biden, people would be rightfully upset by it. But this has been the operation that started, I think, in 2015 to co-opt the freedom movement and to put Trump at the head of it. And then now, of course, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, all these other folks. And again, to the article I'm working on, you have technocrats on both sides, though. Bill Gates in the last couple of days announced he's going to give $50 million to Harris, right? He's also a technocrat, wants to engineer the weather, wants, the vaccines, everything we already know. You have a technocrat versus technocrat, billionaire technocrats versus, if they really are even, against each other, right? But even if you just take that level of like what we're seeing, you can't deny that. Okay, technocrat billionaires on both sides. Alex Karp, who's a co-founder of Palantir along with Peter Thiel. Alex Karp is behind Harris. Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google, behind Harris. Bill Gates now. Alex Karp and Harris and Eric Schmidt are both steering committee members of the Bilderberg Group. Then on the other side, you got Peter Thiel, who funded J.D. Vance to run for Senate, continues to fund Donald Trump. He said he's not giving any money directly this election cycle, but there are some groups like one I found is called America's Future Frontier Fund. They're just using what they call dark money in different ways. They're still
he wrote the
them.
forward for J.D. Vance's book, and he's been J.D. Vance's mentor for a long time.
He's directly tied, whether he's giving direct money this cycle or not. And then, of course, Elon Musk, who's like literally jumping up and down and running around and giving away like $1 million a day to incentivize people to come volunteer and like fight for Trump. Like, so you literally have this technocrat class backing two different quote unquote sides. And then not to mention what we were just talking about, the Zionist lobby, which is behind both of them as well. Like, and so I just don't see how people can deny these facts. And if you're being honest and it's still like, if you, at the end of the day, after hearing all this and everything else we can share, I doubt we'll change too many minds because people are really stuck in their ways. But I hope those who still do have some level of critical thinking and are leaning towards Trump at least can contend with the facts, at least be willing to be honest and mature enough to say, you're right. He is this, there are these things going on. He has said this, he might turn into an authoritarian, and then whatever it is you feel, at least be honest, right? Because I would respect that much more than people who are either just like, oh, you're just a leftist, you have Trump derangement syndrome, you just want to support Harris, you must be, all the different sort of things. It doesn't matter to me. It's silly. The only reason I'm even pushing so hard is because I do care about the future of this broader movement. And I do think this has been a long game operation to destroy and fracture this movement to a level we've never seen. And I think, like you kind of pointed out earlier, you look at the history, just think like 20 years into the history a little bit, 20 years into the future, the conspiracy movement, whatever's left there at that point. And you're going to have people looking back at this time, as you said, thinking like, oh my God, Trump almost did it. Like he got into office. He was this hero. He was fighting the deep state. And then those of us who really saw what was going on, they've already fractured the sort of narrative of what's going on. There are people who think they're in the freedom movement, and that's the narrative they believe in. QAnon, this and that, Trump's secret plan, and JFK Jr. and all this kind of, all the whole thing, right?
Right.
So they, whether you say the intelligent networks, the broader predator class, have absolutely already fractured this movement into smaller pieces and into smaller silos where we're bickering amongst each other, and occasionally we rub up against each other because the Trump people mainly stay in their camp on Rumble and wherever else, and they talk to each other on their podcast, and then this group stays in their area, and then the far left's over here. We're all in our own silos, and it's only a few of us, I think, who bother peeking in what's going on over there, or interacting with these other people to sort of get a wider, broader perspective. Like I try to consume corporate media, mainstream media, left-wing alternative media, right-wing, conspiracy stuff that I know I'm going to disagree with purposely for that reason. And that's more of a full-time job than maybe people think they want to they have or do. But I think that's what's necessary.
You're just trying to see the broader picture.
Doesn't mean I'm going to agree with every perspective.
Exactly.
And obviously I'm not going to agree with every perspective, but I want to at least be informed about what the quote unquote other side, or more specifically, people who might have different opinions than me think, instead of having a caricature of them in my mind of like, this is what they think, and I'm just going to make fun of that. And I think that's what the left, the right, freedom movement, and everybody else, many of us have fallen into. Like we think we know what the other side is thinking. So I was starting to say this earlier. There's a mainstream story going on right now saying that one of Trump's former officials has come out and said that he praised Hitler's generals at some point, and there's been things like this floating around, them trying to equate Trump with Hitler. Again, this came from the New York Times. It came from Atlantic, both suspicious magazines who put out propaganda. But it's not the first person to say that. And again, we can look at Trump's words. And so in my mind, it's like, if you start to add these things up, you don't have to fall into the mainstream narratives about who they say Trump is to still also acknowledge he does appear to be a potential danger for individual liberty. And I think also it might be much easier for the predator class to get their dreams by using Trump, because so many people will make excuses for it.
Right, and because he's wrapped in that false air of freedom.
He throws a bone just enough to each crowd. Like he'll say something about the Fed occasionally, right? He doesn't say "and the Fed," of course. And when he was running the first time, he said something about, "Oh, we need to look into the 28 pages in 9/11," or just throws a bone to each crowd. I love the WikiLeaks, all this stuff. That like kind of pull, like right now, it's, oh, I'm going to free Ross, and of course, I want Ross to be free. I mean, I was there at his trial, friends with his family. It's a horrible situation. But I hate the fact that, in my view, I think he's toying with their emotions and he's manipulated them. Yeah, and even if he did do that, at what cost would it come? Maybe Ross does get freed by Trump if he gets into office, if that's the narrative they want to put in front of us. But then what other horrible things happen as well? And that's not to say horrible things won't happen with Kamala before somebody's like, this guy's just trying to defend. I think, to me, that's obvious. It doesn't need to be said.
For this,
what I see, I don't see anybody in the freedom movement falling for her.
No.
They're falling for Trump. That's why I
and I've
focus so
had
much
people
on
say that to me too. And I was actually looking at your Twitter feed the other day, and the same thing happens to me, where I was reading your replies, and people were like, so what? Does this mean that you want Harris? Or how come you never criticize Kamala Harris? And it's like, who is our audience? Do you think any of our audience at this point are like super far leftist? I highly doubt that. I've
only seen one or two people in my audience who say they're going to vote for Kamala, and they have their own specific reasons. And these are people I know in the real world, so I know they're not trolls. But it's that tiny of a percentage.
That's my
point.
Say. It's a given. It's self-evident for the people who follow us that is extremely tyrannical, that we want nothing to do with that. So we're trying to get people to see that this is a false dilemma that they're engaging with by going with this side. And I don't want to touch on Trump much more than we already have, because I think we've already created a picture, and overwhelmingly people's ideas are already made up at this point. But now I kind of want to move into the more philosophical approach of voluntarism, and then get to the answer to the question that I always get asked, and I know you get asked it too. Don't vote. Okay, well then what's your solution? Because there are endless things that we can discuss that are solutions in that category of things. But before we get there, for the people who listen or watch this podcast consistently, you know that I say that I'm a self-proclaimed voluntarist, and I say that quite a bit. I don't personally think that I will ever engage with voting, although I could see where there is an argument to be made to vote in a sort of defensive manner, with the strong emphasis on, okay, I know that I'm going to engage with this. I know that through doing this, though, I am not energetically outsourcing my power to this individual. The only freaking reason that I am voting for you is with the hopes that maybe you might be able to do some things that you are promising you do, or are going to be able to do, so that maybe the system will sort of fall apart from the inside, so that it can bring about more freedom for those who are, under the grips of it, so to speak. But that's the only way in my mind that I could ever see that argument being made. But even then, it's still morally reprehensible to me to vote. But anyway, I just love to hear your general thoughts on voluntarism.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm always grateful. I think that's one of the reasons that, despite any differences we've had, but the voluntarist sort of foundation understanding is again something I think that's incredibly important. We've tried to promote it more and more through my work and through the People's Reset, kind of like slowly feeding that information to people, because as I was saying earlier, so many people woke up, but I don't think they had any sort of philosophical background to it. Or maybe they came, plenty of people came from thinking they were progressives, and now they sort of had a wake up experience during COVID, and now they feel politically homeless. And so I do prefer the term voluntarist over even libertarian, even though I think there's obviously clear overlap. Yeah. But because of the sort of purposeful confusion about the term of libertarianism, like if most people in the mainstream, at least in the US here, they think it means you must love corporations or something like that, because that's what the mainstream has said. And then you could add to that people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and now Mark Zuckerberg claim that they're libertarian. So there's plenty of confusion about that because of these people who claim that. So I think voluntarism kind of gets a little bit more to the core of it, which is, somebody who believes that all relationships should be voluntary and consensual. And you start there, and then, start thinking about that a little deeper and apply that to your relationships, and eventually you get to the involuntary relationship with government, and you see, that's not a voluntary relationship, right? And then from there, of course, you've got self-ownership and everything that comes from that, like being able, private property as a mixing of one's labor, and different ideas that I think absolutely are important to the foundation of a current society, but definitely a new society, a new communities that can respect these values. So for me, it's been absolutely important. I've been in and around this movement, I guess you could say, that specific aspect, like besides the broader truth conspiracy movement, but specifically going to liberty events, conferences since about 2012 and speaking at them since 2013. So I'm glad to see that it seems to be more people kind of finally ready to pay attention. There's been those of us who've been talking about it for years, and even different times for me, I've kind of put it on the back burner because it's like, I know what I believe. And I honestly feel like I have very little hope of trying to convince the world to become anarchist or voluntarist. Instead, I just try to lead by example, But it's at one point, I think I had this bright-eyed vision of like, yes, we just got to wake up everybody to voluntarism, and they're just going to get it. And for some people, they will. But others, even those who are awake, it's still like a tough idea to them. How do you do things without government? How would that look?
Can you touch on that? Because there's spots in Mexico, and we could talk about different areas of Mexico. Some are obviously like more dangerous than others, whatever. There's a lot of like confusion surrounding that, and also a lot of propaganda surrounding that. But point being, there's a town in Mexico, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that basically said, police, get the F out of here, you're gone. And now they're a self-governing community, which would be an example of voluntarism, from my understanding.
Yeah, and that town is called Cheran, and there's actually more than one or two. And the interesting thing is it's in the same state that is a violent state, and that does have, no, I wouldn't say 100% violent. We live in that state, actually. We live 2 hours away from Cheran. But it does have like cartel activity, gang activity, and things like that. And this is, I think it's a very true statement that we've heard throughout our lives, that, you know, liberty is dangerous. Real liberty is dangerous. Like, if you are the kind of person that does think you want to live without cops and without, doesn't mean we won't replace them with something that we think is more, you know, whether you're talking about community defense forces or whatever. But generally speaking, if you're trying to remove central authority out of your life when it comes to governments and police networks and things like that, that does mean way more personal responsibility to take care of yourself, to protect yourself. And I think that's something that more of us need to think about. And so in some ways, Mexico is very more free in that ways, but it's also free in the sense like the Wild West was free, you know, that there could be lawlessness, I guess you could claim that, right? But yes, Cheran, I think it was just their 13th anniversary this past April of kicking out the cops, the cartel, and the corrupted government officials. And I actually have a documentary on my website. People can check it out. Called Not One Step Back, which is kind of like their motto, and like they were chanting this. But the long story short is that they had been a community that had been facing cartels logging their like thousands-year-old forest, and just kept logging, and some women had been abused, some people had gone missing, things were just getting bad. This is like over a year's period of time, to the point where like their water source was starting to like get messed up, and so they started to talk amongst themselves like, we can't let this go on forever. You know, the story is that somebody spoke up to one of the cartel loggers and said, you know, why are you doing this to us? And they said something to the effect of, we're coming for your women and children next. And that's when the people in the community really like started like, we got to get organized. We can't just like let this keep going. And so one day there was a standoff when the truckers were coming back from logging and they were trying to leave the town, where actually apparently 13 grandmothers blocked the streets and prevented them from leaving. And then that kind of turned into a standoff. These guys pulled out guns. They fired the gun and they shot one of the community members. They didn't kill him, but I think they took his eye out. They like, you know, shot him in the face. And that sort of just, you know, like these, I think in our, especially anarchist, voluntarist, whatever kind of radical philosophies, we sort of, and especially those who watch too much Hollywood, think that there's going to be this like moment where the revolution is like highly planned in details and it comes right when you expect it, instead of just being like a spark that kind of goes off. And in this case, their uprising was a spark. It was just like, somebody got shot and all of a sudden people are like, what the, you know, and everybody starts grabbing sticks and stones and throwing it at them. And before they knew it, they had taken them hostage and taken their guns, and they locked them up in their church. And they're just like, okay, what are we doing? You know, what's going to happen here? They send more people. Like eventually when they realize their guys aren't coming back, like 2 more cops came. These are corrupt cops who came to town. They grabbed them too, get all their guns. And so now they've got like 3 or 4 people locked up in the church in like a kind of makeshift jail. And they're like, what the heck's going to happen? And eventually word does get out, and it's kind of as a standoff. This makes national news, where the federal government learns about this situation. And in this area in Michoacan, and where we're at, there is a predominantly indigenous area. They're the Purepecha people there in that region, who are actually the people who they never submitted to the Aztec. Like they were like warrior people, you know. And so eventually there's a standoff, and the federal government is like, release these people. We promise we'll hold them accountable. And what they had done in the meantime is they basically reverted back to their indigenous ways of organizing, because, you know, all communities are going to figure things out. Humans we're ingenious. We'll figure things out, right? And in fact, what they realized, and this might be kind of hard for some people in the U.S. and the Western world to realize or think about, but political parties were very new to them. They'd only been there for 20, 30, maybe 40 years in their community, because it's a very rural area. They mainly go to the major cities. So they started to realize that neighbors started turning against each other once the political party showed up, and that you're no longer my neighbor. You're on the red team and I'm on the blue team, you know. And they realized like, we want to ban political parties, and they started to go back to the way they would organize, which was basically like with fires. And so you gather on fire, each little neighborhood gets together, and then you send a representative, you come together, and they make decisions. And they decided they wanted to completely revert back to that way of decision making. And they're like, okay, well, how are we going to handle this? They said, okay, we'll release these men. They actually, one of the things is they had strung them up in a tree. They were hanging them, not like killing them, but they were definitely like punishing these people. They were pissed, you know? And so they're like, they showed us the tree. They had ropes around their necks, and they would pull them up, let them hang there for a second, and like let them down. Like, so they were definitely like trying to decide in the community, should we kill these people or not? They ultimately decided they don't want blood on their hands and that they would let them go. Nothing ever happened. Those men were never held accountable.
Of course.
But the federal government did recognize them as an autonomous region, and they have been, autonomous for 13 years. And we've got to visit a few times. I wouldn't say that it's like a perfect example, just like anything. Again, freedom comes at a cost, time, money, energy. There's going to be human, but they're doing it though. I mean, and I think absolutely there's no mistake that we ended up living not too far from there and take inspiration from things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the US is too far from things like that. I mean, it might seem completely foreign from where we are now, but eventually, especially if things do continue in the direction they're going, whether that's unsustainable financial practices that we know are going to result in hyperinflation, things could get to that point. And if you really study what the DOD and different agencies of the U.S. military, I mean, they've put out propaganda videos, you're aware of this, like about a future dystopia where they have to operate in civilian areas against the home population, right?
100%.
So, I mean, not to say prepare for doomsday, but it is important, I think, to pay attention to the potential realities and to know that you're going to need community in those times, and we're going to need each other. And that to me is what really voluntarism comes back. It's like almost like looking at more, hesitate to say, but natural kind of ways that we could go back to, but we're so disconnected from our ancestors. We're so disconnected from tribal ways of organizing and more just localized, actually knowing your neighbors. And because for all the benefits and beauty of the cityscape and the urban environment, we're very disconnected from each other now.
Amen.
I mean, so there's just a lot of areas I think we need to get back to those roots. And voluntarism, for me, is a big part of that philosophy, starting with that as a foundation and building from there.
I don't remember what it's called. I talked about it on a recent episode, actually. It's the number, it's like this proposed number of people that you should have in your immediate community that it's like 150 or something like that. And I've thought about that quite a bit, that the whole point of what you and I are pointing to with voluntarism ultimately leads to, if we go down that road as far as we can, would mean that there is no form of centralized authority, at least not in the form that it currently exists whatsoever. Like, again, there's a difference between government and governance. Like governance, governance is how people organize together for a common good between them all in communities. That's how I look at governance to mean. Whereas government, I'm going to borrow a paraphrase version from Larkin Rose, is essentially the idea that men and women who call themselves government have a unique moral right to initiate aggression or threaten aggression against other men and women or their property. And those men and women have a moral obligation to comply with said men and women who call themselves government. And that, again, flies in the face of voluntarism. But if we go down that road far enough, it looks like us, I think, being so decentralized that we are organizing in much smaller communities. And those smaller communities come together and form agreements with each other. And if you don't like the agreements of that given community that you're a part of, that's fine. You can leave and go find another community or form your own community. That's the whole point, is we come back to mutual agreements, meet the 7 tenets of a valid contract between all men and women who are part of that community, and you're coming together on disputes and how the community organizes together and how defense looks and what punishments there are. You voluntarily sign into that, and if you don't want to be a part of that community, you go find another community. And of course, then people say, well, how will that community defend itself if you won't initiate aggression? That doesn't mean that you don't defend yourself either.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can totally defend yourself against active aggression. That doesn't mean we're all going to be gunless, and that's what I do appreciate about America, despite all of its issues, is that we have maintained our guns. And I think that relative to places like Australia or Canada or parts of the UK or other, let's say Western countries, is that we do have our guns. And I think that largely government sort of looks at that a little bit more carefully when trying to enact measures that could be seen as more tyrannical, because they know there is always that possibility that, like, damn, the civilian population, I hate using the word civilian, the men and women in America are more armed, have more arms than the U.S. government, supposedly. And I actually would think that that's largely true, but that's the whole point, is that it doesn't mean that you can't defend yourself against other acts of aggression.
Yeah.
It means that you will not commit or initiate an act of aggression or threaten an act of aggression.
Voluntarists are not pacifists necessarily. I mean, one could be a voluntarist and choose to be a pacifist, but voluntarism doesn't inherently imply like you don't believe in defending yourself. And so we have land in Mexico. We're forming an intentional community. It's called the Conscious Agora, based on these principles. I mean, it's basically a voluntarist community. Our core foundation is individual liberty, self-ownership, sometimes known as sovereignty of the individual, which is just non-aggression principle, using permaculture principles, and then mindfulness. That's like the cornerstone of like everything we're building from. And I'll notice that when we talk about whether it's voluntarism and the sort of, well, what is going to happen in this case, and there's a million what ifs, right? People can think of a million of those, and not to say we shouldn't even address those, but as you know, you don't always need to have a solution to propose a better answer to something, right? You don't
falsification doesn't necessitate replacement.
You don't have to like say you can answer every single what if question, and then if we don't have the answer for that, then this idea isn't worth it.
Can I give an example of that, like as a basic example? Please hold your train of thought, because I know I want to continue with that. But okay, let's say I said, Reese, my studio manager, I'm saying that she committed this murder. She's the one that committed this murder because I found her hat nearby, right? But no. Reese has all the evidence that she was actually in California during that exact time. She had people with her in California who can corroborate that she was there. She has receipts from her in California. She has video footage of her in California with tag locations. She has airline receipts. All the things indicate very clearly, falsify this idea that she was in or that she committed this murder. Well, you're right. Clearly it wasn't you, Reese. Clearly you have falsified this idea that it was you. But until you can come up with a better explanation for what did cause this, or what is the solution for this, it has to be you. That's what people say when they say, well, until you figure this out, we have to go back to the old way of being.
Yeah, and I think it was either Larkin or somebody early on that I heard say something to the effect of like, imagine people coming in sort of arguing when as the abolitionists started to appear and like, hey, slavery might be wrong, maybe all humans have liberty. And the argument was like, yeah, but who's going to pick the cut? And it's like, okay, I might recognize this is immoral, but I don't have an answer for what comes next, so I'm just going to keep doing the same thing. Right. It's the same thing applies. And so what I was getting at is like, I hear this with voluntarism. I hear it with us forming in a community. People, they'll come up with all the what ifs. So what are you going to do one day if they Waco you? They're going to come kill you. And I guess the general idea is because of some bad thing may happen at some point in the future, potentially, maybe I should do nothing in the meantime because that bad thing may happen one time. And in that particular example, to me, the way I explain people is like, well, while I'm exiting from these systems, I'm going to be eating healthier and drinking clean water and living amongst like-minded people and having a more richy life. And sure, if bad people one day come to try to take those things away from us, we do believe in self-defense. And even if that meant the end of my life, which is not something I pray for or wish for, then at least I could say I lived my life with my values and principles, as opposed to staying still because I was so scared that one day some bad thing may happen. So I'm just going to keep banging my head against the wall, trying the same thing over and over, or just acquiesce and live in fear and go along with the plan, because that's what's going to happen. I think more and more people in the freedom movement need to recognize that doing nothing or doing the same thing over and over, you can be awake all you want and still walk right into the FEMA camp. Like, you're not necessarily doing anything, just watching podcasts all day and just consuming social media feeds that tell you how bad the world is, or just outsourcing your power, like you said, and thinking Donald Trump's going to save me, Kamala Harris, whoever else comes along. We will still end up in that same situation. And that's not to say that there is no hope, again, that things are black-pilled, but I absolutely do think that the amount of energy, time, money, resources, generational planning that the predator class has put into their vision of the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, etc., is a very difficult force to overcome, and that we should, at the very least, plan for how to survive outside of that. And that's why my work focuses on parallel systems. And I'd like to share more about that, but I wanted to say something about the voting you mentioned a couple minutes ago. The only time I ever voted in a presidential race, I was 18. I think I was still in high school or just getting out of high school. I think about a year after, 2004. So I was out of high school for a year, and I voted for John Kerry because I was very anti-Bush, like in those years, post 9/11. I kind of had my first awakening, right? But it was still in the left-right paradigm. Right. That's the first layer. You come to realize, oh my God, there's corruption in the world. These party are a bunch of warmongers. They're freaking crazy. I can't believe they're doing all this. They want to torture people. Obviously, anybody with a brain would be against that, right? So then, of course, the other guy, his cousin, the other guy from Skull and Bones is the answer, right? That was the one. And I kind of feel like, yeah, that's all it really took for me. Then I had some life paths take me in different directions, went to jail and drug addiction stuff. When I got through with that, though, I was kind of coming out and Obama was about to get elected. By that point, I still wasn't fully awake or anything, but I definitely didn't trust any of the stuff they were showing me, right? My point is, like, I have voted before, but it was when I think I was at a very naive state of mind. And I've only voted one other time, and that is in the local election in Houston, actually last year, for this measure, which myself and my partner and a whole team of people, we helped actually pass. Now, to me, the difference in this is that it wasn't for a person. It was for an effort to reduce government. And this is where I would say, like you said, kind of a defensive vote. I still think your vote is wasted on the federal level, maybe even in some cases on the state level, but absolutely local, school board, town council, city council, especially if you have
see
a
the
smaller
real world
area,
effects, man.
you can actually do things there, you know, and I will say Houston, a city of 3.5, 4 million, I think they were maybe too corrupted to really achieve anything, because I'll share, like, we got the thing done, but now they're putting up all the roadblocks they can to keep it from affecting anything.
What was it?
So it was this proposition called Proposition A, and basically it was something that I had actually helped seed in the city's kind of consciousness. I ran for mayor of Houston in 2019, largely for this, to get on TV. Like, you know, I noticed that Derrick Broze, local conspiracy theorist, doesn't get invited to the same place that Derrick Broze, candidate for mayor, does.
Right.
And so I pay them a little fee, and all of a sudden I'm getting invited to radio, TV, newspapers, high schools, old folks' homes.
Using it as a platform to be able to share this message.
I was talking about vaccines in 2019, the year before COVID, on the local level, saying that if I become mayor, we're going to make sure that there can never be a mandate to force it. And
wow.
You know, talking about these things on the TV and stuff. So to me, because I have always been hyper-focused locally, you know, there's a lot of people who might have a huge following on the internet, but they have no connection to their local community. I think it's really important to make sure we do have that. So I've always been hyper-focused on that. Anyways, in 2019, when I ran, I said, if I became mayor, I would actually reduce the power of the mayor's position, because Houston actually has the strongest mayoral position in the entire U.S. It's this bureaucracy. But the point was, I kind of put that idea out there. Well, by next year, 2023, this idea had grown to being put on the ballot as a proposition to take away some of the power of the mayor and to make it more equal with the city council. But really what it did, it said that if 3 council members came together and said, hey, we want to talk about a topic, it automatically goes on the agenda. Wow. Where for the past 50 years, it's been that the mayor's the only one who can set that agenda. So even if all 16 council members say, hey, we care about X, Y, and Z, the mayor, he or she, can say no. And that's basically what they've done about fluoride, 5G, anything I've ever brought to the table. We would get people, a couple council members like, hey, this is a reasonable topic, but we have no power. We can't do anything. So this thing passed in the local election, 80% of the people who did vote, which is still, again, like 4 million people. 100,000 people vote out of that whole thing. So it's like, it's insane when you really realize, not that, again, I'm definitely not advocating voting, but it's just an interesting thing when you realize a city that big, 4th largest city in the country, that mayor, he or she goes and starts making international deals with all kinds, and nobody's even paying attention. And that was not the 100,000 people for one candidate. Right. That person got elected with like 20,000 people voting for them, and they spend millions of dollars. I mean, that's a whole other thing.
That's crazy.
It kind of shows the futility of the whole thing to me. Right. But my point is, I did vote in that. And now that has changed, like, the entire structure of the government. I've been visiting city council the last couple of weeks while we're visiting to talk about fluoride, and trying to, like, nudge any of these council members, hey, put it on the Proposition A, put it, and they already even changed it now. Instead of it just being put on the ballot, it has to go into a Proposition A committee. So they've already found ways to kind of not follow, which is a good example of how you can put all this effort and energy into it. And even on the local level, they will find a way to screw you.
To try to change the system from the inside.
Was it worth it? I mean, it feels like we did some good, and I hope that that does still lead to whether it's fluoride or something else. And it has in one way. We've seen them use Prop A to, like, lower the water bill or do something. So it's like, all right, the mayor's not a total tyrant anymore. Yeah. But they're still playing funny games of how they implement it. So I did vote in that case, but I would never vote in a presidential election. I never voted even for Ron Paul, though I supported him. I definitely was like, hey, this guy seems to be saying something different. But overall, like, when it comes to voting, especially when we're talking about presidential elections, it's a wasted vote. The elections were rigged well before 2020. And I also don't even believe all the garbage that a lot of the Trump supporters believe about election, this and that. But the point is, they want them fighting over this. And I think this is by design. And even if you do believe that, though, to only focus, there's 2 things with that. To only focus on 2020 as if it's the only questionable everything
election.
Was good before then.
Everything was good before then. But also, think of how absurd it sounds that, okay, the quote, Democrats cheated in 2020, quote, that means we should just get out and vote harder in 2024. Like, that is absolutely absurd to me. And to your point, yes, there might be some points, like I said earlier, like you're saying now, where it makes sense to vote at a local level. But I think beyond that, state level, federal level, just like you're saying, if you're putting all of your eggs in that basket, putting so much time, energy, effort, even giving money towards that, when you could be doing things like creating a freaking intentional community, which is largely what I want to focus on for the rest of this podcast anyway, is implementing solutions outside of voting. And that doesn't mean you have to go start or join an intentional community. There's things that you can borrow and adopt from things that you're doing with your intentional community in your own neighborhood and things like this.
So I just wanted to say, because I know that, so we're talking about voluntarism, and generally speaking, I think you and I both agree on arguing the immorality of voting in the system in the first place, right? And for those who are not familiar with that, just the general idea that you can't force people to be free, right? So if it's not right for me to hold a gun to your head and take money out of your pocket, and even if I claim I'm going to feed the homeless or do something good with it, it's not right if men's with guns from the government come do it for you. You know, if you vote and say, well, I'm not holding the gun to you directly, I voted for Trump and now he's doing it, or I voted for Harris. The immorality doesn't disappear just because now a so-called government.
Just because you're abrogating your own responsibility and shifting it onto someone else, that doesn't mean it's
so
somehow
in that
moral.
same vein of thinking, then often, and I've said this myself, that like I think it is you could argue voting is an act of violence, or is voting immoral, participating in that system, right? Because ultimately somebody is going to be forced to go along with that agenda. Now, you might all believe, whether it's the Trump side or the Harris side, that you're doing this though for the good of the rest of Americans. Even if they don't get it, we're going to drag them all with us, right? Because we need the free healthcare, or we need Trump to deport everybody. We need whatever it is that they think is the best thing for the country. They want to force it on the other people. And this, of course, inevitably gets us where we are, where they're clashing. Right. The country is allegedly, heavily divided and going at each other like this. I think that, to me, the bigger picture is that by participating in that, you are somewhat giving away your power. And I know that not everybody sees that, and maybe they think it's like a fluffy philosophical argument that has no place and bearing in reality. But I do think spiritually, energetically, and even just concretely, it does apply that by choosing to participate, especially with everything we already went over, when we can clearly see, like, here's a lineup of Harris and here's a lineup of Trump and all the similarities and the problems and this and that, but you're still going to say, I'm still going to do that, right? I'm still going to force my way, because even if the left doesn't like it, Trump's going to make America better and they'll have to deal with it, right? I've thought about this even when I was voting for Prop A on the local level, right? Okay, I know that 90% of the city is not going to vote, but in my mind, and I'm able to say, maybe this is just me justifying, right? I'm rationalizing. I'm like, okay, in my mind though, by voting and participating in this, it's going to reduce the power of the mayor, and whether these people realize or not, because they're not paying attention, it's good for them. And that, because then maybe other good things can happen. Hey, maybe we're going to be able to use this thing to end water fluoridation finally, and then millions of people won't be poisoned anymore. So then the sort of, I guess, philosophical dilemma is like, is participating in that immoral system with the hope that, okay, I'm going to end up being able to get rid of fluoride though if I just pass this measure. I think it's a little less in your face, because this wasn't for a person, this was just for an act.
Yeah.
But anyways, I'm willing to go down that road as far as like my own actions and say, like, okay, was I participating in a moral system? Am I trying to force freedom on people? Ultimately, we know we can't force it on people. That's the whole voluntarism ideal, is that it's going to spread one by one, by individual, not collectively. In masses, it usually doesn't happen that way. It has to happen on this individual level where people come to recognize their own power and see the immorality as these things, and then also start looking for real solutions. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that point, because it's like a battle I sometimes have in my own head. Of like,
I love that though. I mean, that shows that you, even as a voluntarist, are still questioning your own paradigm and questioning like the foundational belief system you have. And on that note, what you just brought up about how the energetics of outsourcing your power, and whether that could be seen as too esoteric or woo-woo possibly. The reality is that our actions or inactions are largely, overwhelmingly, a result of our foundational belief system. So if you foundationally believe that, oh, this man or woman has power over me, so I don't want them to be in power, I want this individual, I'm going to outsource my power to them so that that person who I'm scared of can't be in power. You're outsourcing your power to this individual that you like, while simultaneously being so fearful of that individual, which is all predicated on your own individual beliefs. So if you can shift a collective of people, even just in a local area, let's think, for example, Free State Project in New Hampshire. That's a perfect example of people who are getting together that are like, no, it doesn't matter. And you talk to people who live in New Hampshire, and overwhelmingly they're like, I don't give a shit if it's Kamala or Trump, because we know we have like-minded community around us, that it doesn't matter what happens at that level, because we're all on the same page that we don't believe any man or woman in those positions have power over us to begin with, and they're actually implementing solutions at that level. And then further, if you do want to get sort of esoteric and woo-woo, but I don't think that it is, if you study the work of people like Veda Austin or even Rupert Sheldrake on morphic resonance, and this idea of your thought energy actually bringing about real things in reality, when we're focusing all of our energy on one thing, whether it's positive or negative, and in this case, saying that this man or woman has power over me, or I'm very fearful of that man or woman, that is actually possibly going to create the effects of that in reality itself. So whether you want to look at it from a woo or non-woo lens, if that's what you want to call it, doesn't matter. Ultimately, your fundamental belief systems do drive your actions, or maybe have an impact on reality itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is something more and more of us need to pay attention to, the way we're putting our energy. I really even try to strive with everything we're speaking about. I'm not trying to bring in the apocalyptic, Trump is a tyrant reality. I wish that wasn't our reality, but all signs around me point to these directions, these people being controlled, etc. But also I strive to like make sure because it's easy, I think, for us to get pulled into the darkness, and the darkness, I mean, of always looking for conspiracies. I've noticed this a lot with my journalism, that people want to see the worst, most crazy headline. They want the most salacious thing to do with Epstein. But if you show them, here's 5 steps to build your own garden and grow your own food for a year, you get barely any views or anything like that, right? And so it can be a cycle, especially for those of us who are trying to do our part to analyze events and provide some level-headed thinking there, to not let yourself get pulled into that cycle as well. And I really strive not to do that. Like, don't just pay attention to what's trending, the trending drama of the week, the latest, thing to be offended by or whatever. Because you do allow it to drive your attention and your energy after a while. So it's like, you have to be very guarded in your heart and your mind as you kind of peer into that abyss and like, okay, I'm going to take some information, try to share it with other people. Here's my analysis, but not be pulled into it. And the other thing is really emphasizing, like, putting the time and energy, same time and energy you are to paying attention to Klaus Schwab on what is your 2030 going to look like?
Hey,
what are you actually doing?
What is your agenda? Exactly.
Exactly. Spending time doing that, like looking, I actually wrote a whole essay called Welcome to 2030. I own land, live amongst like-minded people, and life has never been happier. And took their whole thing turned it on its head and like really spent time describing what is that waking up in the same way that the woman who originally wrote that described their 2030 of Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life's never been better. Like, we need to put that same energy into that for our own visions.
In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the thing that I always say, and I borrow this from this lady from the UK named Jacqueline Dunn, she says it so perfectly, is there's a difference between being aware of something and consumed with something. And what we're talking about here, even at the beginning of this episode where we're talking about all the clear indications that Trump is not pro-freedom, as he claims to be, like we're focusing on some seemingly, quote, dark things, right? It's just painting a picture of awareness so that you can make more informed decisions and you're not outsourcing your power. And again, I don't look at it like a black pill, as I know you don't as well. It's more of the white pill. It's like, whoa. I don't have to outsource my power as an individual to men and women in government to go do something for me to create a more free, more prosperous life, healthier life for myself. And imagine if so many other people adopted that same approach of like, no, I'm not outsourcing my power to any individual that calls themselves government or an agent of the government. I choose to exercise my own power inherent to me. And the analogy that I like to give with sort of being aware of some of these things, but again, not being consumed by them, is we've all had this experience where we're sitting in a crowded room where there's a lot of conversations going on. And as we're sitting there, we can sort of zoom out and sort of hear all the conversations happening at once where we can't really make out the details. But then we also have an ability to hone in on one of the single conversations being had, right? And sort of isolate those away from the other conversations. And maybe this conversation over here is talking about something that is very dark, fear-provoking, and that is, as you continue to listen in, your body will start taking on characteristics of that. You will start ruminating on that, and you may want to go join in on that conversation and give your input, or you may want to say, tell them to shut up or stop. But the point is, you could also zoom back out and hone in on a different conversation that's being had that's related to, I don't know, like gardening, some of the solutions that we're going to talk about in a minute. The point being that we're all sitting in a crowded room, so to speak, especially in this information age with social media and the proliferation of information. It's information overwhelm, right? And we get to choose which conversation it is that we engage in while surveying the landscape of conversations being had, being fully aware of all the conversations that are being had in the room, but choosing to participate in and engage in and take on the characteristics of that conversation that we perceive to be beneficial. And that's where I think, like, the so-called black pill community, I completely agree with a lot of people who say that, oh, well, if you're just saying don't vote and then you're saying we're all fucked, like, that's not helpful. I completely agree. Like, and I would consider those people a black pillar, like, oh, we're all fucked either way. It doesn't matter who gets elected. That's not the case at all, in my opinion. It's just raising awareness to, okay, obviously this lady over here, Kamala Harris, and all those people, they're just so psychopathic and tyrannical. We don't want that. But, well, this individual over here is also not the option. Here's the reasons why. And even beneath that, like, this idea that we need to put anyone, or that men and women who call themselves government have the right to initiate acts of aggression against other men and women, and that those other men and women have a moral obligation to comply, that itself needs to be questioned. And even a layer below that, okay, there are countless solutions outside of this idea that we need to vote in order to preserve our freedom, our prosperity, abundance, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I want to get into next with this conversation, especially with you being someone who's in the middle of actively setting up a conscious community. And I know there's so many other people who are doing the same thing, which is incredible. But I want to take some of those things. Let's maybe start at that high level of, like, what can be done. And maybe you, as someone who's setting this up, your sights are set because you're seeing it occurring on what could potentially happen on the beneficial, benevolent side of things, of like, oh my God, we're starting with this, but look where this could go. So let's start there, and then we can tailor it down to the individual, what they can do in their local community, or even just for themselves or their family, that is far more important than just going out and voting for X candidate they think is going to help bring in more freedom.
Yeah, you said a lot of good things there. I mean, I'll just reiterate what you were saying as far as the importance of, really, it's like in our entrainment, our focus, training our focus to, like you said, sort of be aware of things, but not kind of consumed by them. I think that's great, because we do need that. It's important to, humans have survived for so long because of our awareness, including our fear, including, these things that give us indications of our natural environment. There's some good data out there, and much more intelligent and informed researchers than myself who have shown that the changes of our human experience has made it where we have all this extra excess fear and energy here that used to be like guarding us from saber-toothed tiger or from the environment, and life has gotten much more easier for humans. So now we've got these anxieties and things that we don't necessarily know where to redirect. Funny thing is, the mainstream will kind of say that's what causes conspiracies. People are just trying to simply explain the world, and so they look for patterns where they aren't or whatever. But beyond that, we do really do that. We do look for things like that, and it's important to be the one who's in control of that, so you don't become consumed by only those potentials. And the other point you made, as far as like building community, and I think this is just important for everybody to think about as we get into the solutions conversation, that, for example, like our intentional community, our eco village, in some ways was started as a response to what's going on in the world. I mean, I originally wrote about this idea in 2017, the Conscious Agora, in my book called Manifesto of the Free Humans, sort of, again, imagining like, what would a voluntarist community look like if I designed it? And it's just an imaginary thing that I didn't know would necessarily come to fruition. I had hopes for it, but it was just like, here's my thought experiment, right? Then COVID comes along, the whole COVID 1984, March 2020, we moved to Mexico like pretty much right away. We'd already been visiting Mexico. We knew like this is something we wanted to do. So instead of it being a distant idea of 5 to 10 years in the future, we're going to do this, it's like, all right, let's start working on that idea really seriously, right? So in some ways, it was a reaction, it was a response. But ultimately, what I like to remind people is that moving in this direction of solutions, or what I call exit and build, which I'll elaborate more on in a moment, isn't about running away from things. Sure, it can be, again, with that awareness that you're like, yeah, these things are going on over here. I'm not going to be consumed and feared by them, but I'm definitely seeing the things march in that direction. So I'm going to look for alternatives that I can, live in, so I can continue to live healthy, with, the lifestyle that I like, with people I care about, and stay free for my kids and their kids long into the future. That's really where my mind is focused. So it's not just freedom for us, because obviously you're a parent, you understand, like, making sure it's not just about making sure you get out okay, but making sure that the
generation
world,
principle.
exactly, seven generation principle and beyond. Like, that's what I'm focused on. And that means we have to do the hard work now, and that we might not even see the fruition of our labor at this point in time. But we know that we're doing so in the hopes that the generations after us will have something better. And also, I think if you flip the 7 generations the other direction, going back to our ancestors, that all the 7 generations and beyond that came before us, I tend to think that if we don't act now with all the information that we see there's a train wreck ahead, and to choose not to act is selling them out. All the blood, sweat, and tears that all our ancestors from all parts of this planet had to go through to get us here. And then with the thought of those coming after us, that's really where my motivation is. So it's not so much that we're exiting and running away or preparing for doomsday. Sure, we're aware of those things. Like you said, we have that in our awareness, but we're not being consumed by it. But at the end of the day, if I was to wake up tomorrow and to realize, oh my God, I really am a conspiracy theorist, none of this stuff is real, I was just so paranoid, I can't believe it. Oh, well, I'm living in an intentional community and I have organic food and I'm still living a better life.
Than that, right?
So the way I see it is, like, even if this turns out to be that I am just crazy, or it all goes away, or we stop it, or we fix it, or whatever the heck may be, or it continues to progress, which is, I think, what's going to happen, we have carved out our own life that actually reflects the values that we want to live by. And that is the bigger picture. So it's not running away. It's not giving up. It's not apathy. It's none of those things. I first started to write about what I call exit and build in 2019. I published this book January 2020. It was the first edition of my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. And that was coming out of, like, and it's sort of like a part warning of, like, hey guys, pay attention to what's coming, because so much of my independent journalism and my investigations, my documentary work has focused on studying surveillance systems, not only because I care about freedom of speech and privacy, but because I found out I was under surveillance by Houston police back in 2013. I was leaked some pictures showing, like, a training session with me up on the freaking wall, and I was told I had a criminal intelligence division officer assigned to me. That set me on a path of, like, well, what does that really mean? So I learned about Stingray cell phone surveillance tools. I learned about heat detection, gait detection, facial recognition, social credit scores, all this stuff, right? So when I was writing this book in late 2019, it was partially a warning of, like, hey guys, some bad things are coming, but it was also saying, and here's some ideas that maybe we should try to avoid what's coming. And it was largely built off the ideas of Samuel Edward Konkin III and his ideas of agorism and counter economics. And, again, like I said, I've been involved in the libertarian voluntarist movement, a huge nerd for a lot of the philosophy and stuff. I encourage people to look into his work, but the short story is, like, he was seeing what was coming back in the 60s and 70s. He was involved in the student activist movements at the time, the draft card burning, and he could see already at the time that politics wasn't going to be the answer. In fact, most of the people in the modern American libertarian movement, which preceded the Libertarian Party, were anarchists. And then eventually some of them thought, okay, the party, forming a political party would be the best way. So 1970, 1971, the party gets formed. Konkin was very much opposed to that. And, like, he participated in the party, but only to kind of be a thorn in its side and say, like, we're going off message here, we're getting away from it. But again, people say, well, if you're not going to join the party, what's your solution? And his idea was what he called counter economics. And he started to study this collapse of the Soviet Union and different areas of the world where you could see when hyperinflation came or when government got more tyrannical, there's an equal and opposite reaction where people seek an alternative. And he realized that the underground economy, the black market, the gray market, or what he called the counter economy, and he was kind of playing on the words of the times. You had the counterculture. He was like, this is the counter economy, parallel economy, underground economy, informal economy, which has been studied pretty well now academically. But in Konkin's time, he was just saying, like, look, what if we were to actually activate those people, not just the people who are day laborers who just work untaxed because that's just what they do, but to activate in the consciousness to get more and more people to realize that there's actually strength to be outside of those systems. And we take he focused on the money side of things, taking our money away from them and building counter institutions. And he actually described, like, a 4-stage thing that he would progress through. It's all his theory, right? So it's not going to play out perfectly, right? But I think a lot of the things he wrote about were very prescient. And unfortunately, he died in 2004 before things like Bitcoin and social media and many things that he predicted that he thought would play a role. He was already into cryptography. He knew that we needed to have tools to protect ourselves. And so anyways, I've been hugely inspired by him, and I wanted to take those ideas and kind of adapt them to the digital age. And so what I call exit and build is very much an extension of what he had already put out there, that we should consciously take our time, money, energy away from these systems, avoid taxes where you can, do business in the untaxed. Like he described the mainstream economy as the white market. This is the tax traced economy that most average people are in when they get a check that's already got federal income tax taken out of it. That's like the average person, right? Then the gray and black markets. And again, as a voluntarist, he didn't believe in violence. So people hear black market, they think mafia activity, maybe violence and stuff. He actually had another term that he called the red market, which was illegal and violent activity, but nonviolent, technically illegal or frowned upon activity that the state believed was illegal. He called the black and gray economy, and said that if we put more of our energy and time in there and consciously, make these efforts, that over generations we will build counter institutions, and the state, we can assume, and I think it's true, would get more and more aggressive. And again, people start looking for alternatives. Right now, people are asking us, well, what else is there, right? I see that things are bad. I'm not going to vote. Well, what comes next? That's kind of the role that I've chosen to play, and I think many of us are starting to do, is building the foundations for whatever these parallel institutions are going to look like. And in the long term, I mean, Konkin predicted, Murray Rothbard, others talked about like the need for defense institutions eventually. I think that's longer term. We've seen that if we move too quick with these ideas, like for example, in the Silk Road case with Ross Ulbricht, he was absolutely inspired by Konkin. He was an agorist. Like that was the whole experiment of what he was doing, was an untaxed trace market out of the government's hands. But as Konkin warned about, if we move too quick, the state will make us an example out of us, right? That his idea was we need to grow the consciousness of the people and of this movement to the point where we could actually protect each other.
Which is why sharing ideas is one of the most important things you do. Like the ideas themselves are solutions because, again, what drives people's actions are their fundamental belief systems. So if you get more people to dissolve their conditioned belief systems surrounding authority, surrounding government, surrounding the belief that other men and women have the right to tell them what to do just because they call themselves government. And a lot of people start reforming their belief systems, dissolving those. That itself is a solution.
Yeah, I think he said, there's even a quote from him that said something about like needing to infect the mainstream consciousness, but kind of in that general idea, that you need to spread the idea. And so I think that probably, unfortunately for his life, he died too early to really take the ideas on. But the reality is, and I saw this during COVID, that more and more people live these ideas, even though they've never heard him. And that's what I think is so beautiful about the idea, about the concept and the values, is they're just an extension of libertarianism and voluntarism, but they're the how do we get there part. Like, okay, we know the philosophy, but how do we get to that agora, to that free place where we can exchange ideas and goods and services? His idea was counter economics and building these parallel systems. And I think more and more people see that as necessary, that COVID 1984 showed people that I can't trust the government when it comes to healthcare. I can't trust. So we start looking for building alternative systems, alternative economic ideas and things of that sort. To me, I took that idea and I was looking at this growing incoming police state. The book also looks at the history of the technocratic philosophy, political philosophy, and how that really is what's driving most of our world. I kind of mentioned earlier all the different technocrats. I mean, a technocrat is somebody who wants to use, back in the day when they were first describing it, they would just say the machines, and taking the scientific elite and the engineers to micromanage society and centrally plan it. Today we would call that AI, and using the tools of that, and which is just a tool, of course, but using it in a way where they think they can create some sort of utopia, and they want to create what they call the technate, and there will be a technate king at the top of it. This is very much what's driving us. So the book is kind of, here's the history of technocracy, here's the history of agorism and counter economics, and here's how I think that is part of, at least, I don't say the only, but at least part of the solution to what we're facing. And so to me, when I talk about exit and build, we can look at the landscape of everything we've described. Nobody here listening to this can claim to be ignorant of what's going on, of what we're facing, what's at stake. We can look at those ideas without, being consumed by them. And if you see what's coming, and again, you know that you've got your ancestors at your back, you got the coming generations depending on you. Everything that we do or do not do, the world that they're going to be born into is 100% dependent on what we do or don't do. The actions we do take or do not take. So you understand all that, and you see what's at stake. You can either keep voting and keep playing the same game and hoping something different. You can check out, become black-pilled, become apathetic, YOLO, just whatever, give up. And I think what most people is some combination of apathy and just, because I've heard this a lot, I'm just trying to get what I can for my family. I'm just trying to take care of my own, which I totally get. Like, that's our instinct, is just to protect our own. But we kind of live in a bubble, right? I can't tell you the amount of people I've talked to who are kind of awake in some ways. They know something's going on in the world. They know things aren't right, but they're also not doing a single thing about it. Like, they don't even listen to the podcast necessarily, anything like that. They just working class people going about their lives. I count members of my family like this who see what's happening, but are they actually doing anything to prepare for it? Are they exiting the systems? No, they're just kind of like watching it happen.
Mindlessly droning about.
And so I looked at that in the book and I was like, so you can either, I called that one apathy is death, choosing to do nothing while you see what's coming, because that's, I think, what will lead to both eventually a physical death as well as a spiritual death, to choose to do nothing when you see what's happening.
It's like what Jesus talked about, being lukewarm.
Exactly. You have to be, I think what we're facing requires bold action right now, and honesty and being real with ourselves. So I don't think anybody listening to this is choosing apathy. I don't think anybody listening, maybe some people are still going to vote, and that's fine. Again, what I'm about to share, you can vote again. If you choose to vote, you can do that, but also consider some of these ideas. Don't simply vote. One of my favorite quotes from Thoreau is like, if you're going to vote with your whole self. Don't just cast a piece of paper. This idea that it goes beyond just the ballot box and just pressing a button every 2 to 4 years. If you feel the need to do that still, then fine, do that. At least be educated and informed about the decision you're making, but don't put all your eggs in that basket. Like, look to other ideas. And so then what else is left? If people would think apathy, well, you have other options. You have exit and build. And I talk about this idea in 2 different forms. One is physical location. So I believe you moved somewhere, right, to come to Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your exit and build journey, right? We moved to Mexico. Some people move different countries, states, cities.
New Hampshire.
Yeah, things like that. So that's kind of the idea of like, if you recognize, so for example, especially during COVID 1984, and you realize, oh my God, I live in a place where they went super tyrannical. I don't think I want to stick around this for the next whatever comes. I'd rather go somewhere where, 30 minutes away, an hour away, or a state away, they were a little bit more friendly to freedom, and there's more like-minded people. So you're going to exit from one place and go build or contribute your skills, in a new place. So that's kind of one basic level in terms of physical location. But I think what's mostly applicable probably for this conversation, because there'll be some people who say, yeah, Derrick, that's not realistic for me. I can't pick up my whole life.
Can't leave California.
I can't leave this and that. And
Right.
I get, like, I can empathize with that. And I will also try to say, but if you really want it, you can make it happen.
Right.
Because I saw during COVID, we saw entire families from Canada who were like, I got to get the heck out of here. We were helping people come to Mexico who were just looking for a temporary place or a long-term place. And we saw people selling everything they own to make sure that they could keep their kids and their families safe. So if you really want something, you can make it happen. But I do understand if that feels overwhelming, the idea of just picking up and moving, because in the book, I also talk about the idea of holding down the fort. Maybe you are a person who's like, look, yeah, it's tyrannical where I'm from, but I'm not giving up, not that is what I'm advocating, but they're like, I'm committed to being here. Right. So that's fine. You can hold down the fort, commit to your area, or if you think it's better somewhere else, exit and build for, greener pastures, that kind of thing. But the broader picture of exit and build kind of expands on Konkin's ideas. If you recognize that there are systems that we are currently operating within that are going to become slavery systems. Some of them are already here and staring us in the face, and others are on their way to there. So we could talk about the economy, banking. The banks, there's plenty of reasons not to use them already, but if you keep your money in them, they're either going to turn into CBDCs or they're going to turn into stable coins where they can track and trace them. If you remain completely dependent on the local big box grocery store and you have no connection to your farmers, to your growers, the animal people, whatever your diet is, if you have no connection to that, then there will come another emergency, and maybe it won't be a vaccine passport, but it might be something else. The point is you're still dependent on that system, right? So you want to, the exit and build idea is to sort of take what I call a holistic self-assessment and look at these different areas of your life. I tend to focus on the main areas that I think we were under attack during COVID, which is food. They try to prevent people from getting food from places. You can't come into this place without proof of vax or whatever. Money, obviously trying to squeeze people financially for their choices and who they donated to. The other one I think that's important is education. And I mean, not only in terms of education, like with the kids who are in the mainstream education system, but also what we've been talking about today, the information we consume, exiting and building from unhealthy, incorrect disinformation, things like that, finding better information sources. So you got your food, you got your money, you got your knowledge and education, technology, big tech. This is another big way, of course, that they're kind of
this is an interesting one because
this is a big part of the puzzle, and the way that they're corralling people into those systems by using the devices. And then we could go on from that. But the point is, like, you look at these different areas of your life and sort of look at it like you're looking for what are your vulnerabilities, because these are the areas, if and when whatever it comes next, alien invasion, clan pandemic, war, blah, blah, whatever they've got up their sleeve, this is the ways they will squeeze us. We saw them squeezing people in these different areas. And a lot of people who saw through the narratives, but we're still like, but yeah, I got to work I got to travel for work. So I guess I'm going to gamble and get the shot, or I'm going to let them stick this thing up my nose. I don't want to, but I have no other choice because I've just been watching things get worse and doing nothing. And this is my exact point. We know what's going on now, so why don't we start actually getting more forward thinking, action oriented, and putting time into that? Because we can guess that we haven't seen the last of these strategies and these squeeze points. They will use, they're already pushing digital IDs in other ways, but one of the other ways will be carbon credits and things like this. Right. These are problems. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just for people to understand why we're looking for the solutions, right? These are the ways that they can and will squeeze you, whether it's about the climate narrative or claim viruses or whatever the narrative, the storyline is, they will squeeze us in these different areas. So the idea is to be as independent from those systems as possible. Doesn't mean you're going to do it overnight. Doesn't mean that it's even maybe 100% possible to be totally 100% off the grid, not dependent on anything in the world that they've built. But I do know that community is key. That coming together and doing it together makes each of these different areas that much more doable. And we can get deeper into those. But that's sort of the basis of the exit and build idea. You see a system that doesn't align with your values or is headed towards slavery, or they've already shown us what's coming next. You need to start taking steps to unplug from that system. And it's again, it's not an overnight thing. It's a path. Like in my book, I encourage people, like with the banking thing, like make a 6-month plan. Like, because some people will be like, yeah, well, I hear you, but I've got so many things connected. It's like, well, if you're not willing to just change banks and go through some trouble doing that, or you're not willing to just use a non-Google search engine, well, I think you just met the level of how much you really want to be free.
Right.
In my book, I
call it the
probably
a spectrum for each of those categories.
It's going to be different for everybody.
To your individual
and that's the whole
needs,
point.
Right.
In the book, I call it the freedom formula. And this is important because it is very individual, right? So like, you need to know, first of all, what does freedom mean to you? And we can each define that in our own ways, but I don't even mean philosophically. Like, again, do the thought experiment of what is your 2030 and beyond. Like, okay, I want to be on land, fresh water, this and that, or I just want to live in a neighborhood where I feel safe with other, like, whatever it is. Think of it. Right. Spend time writing that down, visualizing it. If you're an artist, like, draw it. Like, really put some power into that, right? So you know what you're aiming for. Then the second part of the equation is, what are you willing to do to get it? That's the big point, right? Because what that equals, what you want, your vision of freedom, what you're willing to do to get it equals your actual experience of freedom. And if there's a disconnect between you have this vision, this powerful, beautiful vision, but trying a new Google search engine, that's too much for me. Trying to, use a privacy phone, trying to grow my own food, or at least go to the farmer's market and make relationships. If these steps are too much, then maybe you don't really want it as bad as you think you do. Right. And that's not to say that there aren't other ways, but the point is, you need to know what it is you're after in the first place to know if you're ever going to get there, and at least to strive towards that goal, right? Because if we don't even know what the goal is, how can we know if we even get there or if we're headed in the right direction, right? So I think that's one big problem, going back to the sort of movement having a lack of a philosophical foundation, is knowing what it is we do want. We know so much about what we don't want. We know that we don't like pedophiles. We don't like this thing. We're so angry about this thing. We're so mad, pointing all our fingers outwards. We're not spending any time looking at ourselves and asking how we're playing a role in this, and much less what else we would like in its place, And so that to me is kind of start there, then start looking at, like, what are you willing to do to move forward in each of these areas as you have this different assessment? You could, like I said, finances, food, big tech, go into these different areas and see, right now I've got student debt. I'm, got 20 credit cards, and maybe I could get rid of this one. Start making a plan to become at least more free and less dependent on those systems, and see where you get. I guarantee you will get somewhere much more valuable than just pressing a button once every 4 years and hoping that Trump or whoever else takes care of all your problems.
And the other thing on exiting and building, the emphasis that you put on community, I think is so incredibly important, because it is incredibly challenging for one individual or even one family to do all of the things that are necessary to fully extract themselves from these various systems, from the system at large, so to speak. So it does require that you have community around you. For example, like, one of the things that I advocate for quite a bit is, okay, you don't have to get a freaking full-scale regenerative farm if you can't afford to do that, nor do you have the time to implement that. But try to grow a little bit in your backyard if you can, or even on your balcony. But even if you can't do that, or you just don't have a green thumb, so to speak, make friends with someone around you who is really good at growing food, and then you yourselves find another thing that, okay, what are some other areas where we are entrenched and this system has me by its grips that I can extract myself from, that I can benefit this community, so that at the very least, we as a small community, whether that's an online community or more importantly, I think in-person community, but both are important, have all of the resources that we need between us and this little group, where irrespective of what happens with that tyranny, we know that we will be okay because we have a self-sustaining economic system, alternative system itself outside of that.
I absolutely agree, man. I mean, it's so important for people to spend time trying to build community. I touched on this a little bit earlier, how I think a lot of us have a focus of just virtual, just the internet. Obviously, we wouldn't have all been connected. We wouldn't have the movements without the internet. We get that, but the art of being face to face with people, handing a flyer to somebody, being connecting in person is really becoming increasingly lost, which is why I know that you and I both share the appreciation and value of in-person events, and why that's so important and how those can be really life-changing. I want to share just 2 examples of how community can really help these things come to life. We just got back from the UK and from Denmark, and I've been to the UK one time. I've seen how things are a little bit more advanced. Like lots of Europe's a bit further than some of the things we're seeing in the US. We actually got detained at the airport for 4.5 hours for saying no to facial recognition when we first flew into London. But that's a whole nother story. But I'd seen some of it. I've heard some from friends like who are out there who are activists, and they're like, okay, I hear the exit and build idea. I get it. I also recognize that while I do believe in these ideas, that the beauty of decentralization is that they're going to look different in each country, each city, each state, based on the local environment, the resources, of course, the laws and the way the government is, because some governments are more aggressive and people have to learn to adapt. But that doesn't mean that they can't be adapted. In fact, we've seen that these ideas, I saw it during COVID, so many people adapting them to their specific needs. And we saw an example of that when we went to Denmark. I didn't know this before we went to Denmark. We had an event in Copenhagen. It was about 60, 70 people showed up. And I was given a talk, but it was mainly like a group discussion on they're hearing my ideas about exit and build. And they're like, we already got a digital ID here. Like it's not mandatory, but you can't ride the bus without it. You can't open a bank without it. You can't, so that's not mandatory, but try to function without it. But to me, that reemphasizes the need to be out of their systems. Like and in the US particularly, especially for anybody who comes from Hispanic, Latin American communities, there's so much energy into getting into the system. Like you're not a real person until you get that ID. Now you're
I look at that as like a better thing now.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If we could show people that like, hey, there's actually strength in being outside of the systems, right? So in Denmark, though, we're a place where most of these people, they're awake in a lot of ways and they see things, but they've gone their whole lives kind of living the normal life. So that means they've got bank accounts, they've got this, they're on the digital ID system. There was one person in the whole room who said he didn't use it. And then even then he had to admit that but I kind of cheat because sometimes I can't function without it. So I get my girlfriend to use hers so that I can, do this or that.
Right.
Like he's trying to navigate it, right? So there are already places that are living in this, and this is not some far off thing. And they were telling me, like, even after we left, our friend who hosted us told us that after, we left, she got like a ticket, something to do with environmental, something or other. They took a license plate off the car and like held it until you come pay the money. Just things are pretty advanced. And it's all, of course, digitally integrated and stuff. So for them to even ride the bus or the subway, they got to check on. And Denmark's very known for public transportation, biking, and stuff like that. But what she showed on one hand is that like the people have been given so many things from government, like free education, free all this stuff, which is of course coming through involuntary taxation. But a lot of them felt like, well, in the past, I hear you, it is immoral, it's being taken from our pockets, whether we like it or not. But in the past, it actually functioned to some degree. Now they're like, it's not even functioning. It's not even serving those purposes. The schools are crap. The healthcare is not good. It's just the billion, so they're seeing the same problems that even in this utopia where people are like, oh, we need more like the Scandinavian countries and bring that to the US.
You hear that so much.
That because of that, though, there's this built-in trust of the government. So people don't want to rock the boat. They're also known as one of the happiest countries in the world. And I think that's a beautiful thing, but it's also maybe created a state of mind where people don't want to be unhappy and want to question things. There was resistance there during COVID. But my point is the way they are thriving in the face of that is community. We actually were able to go visit an intentional community, which is about an hour or so northwest of Copenhagen. So out of the city. And it's a community, I think, of 16 different families. And the interesting thing is they were saying not all the families are technically, quote unquote awake. Like some of them might be vaccinated or whatever, but they're starting their journey of getting out of the city and getting some land. And about, 3 or 4 of those families are all on the same page as far as freedom and voluntarism and everything. And to them, it's like, look, we hear what you're saying. Like right now, I'm kind of having to use the digital ID thing while they prepare for their exit, right? So sometimes you have to reverse it and you can build your resources up as you're preparing to make your exit, right? Like whether that means financial resources, making a plan in general, or untangling yourself from the bank accounts and from all these things. But even in that place where the agenda has already gone along, we're meeting in a room full of people who are just as, like excited and in terms of like solutions and who are just as energetic about this as you and I about how they're going to take it on. So even as things have progressed, people aren't giving up. They're not just like acquiescing and saying, never mind. And then the other thing is just in our community alone. Like, I'm not a wealthy guy by any means. We first saw this property in May 2020. It was well beyond our range just when it was myself and Miriam. But eventually we realized, like, hey, we're going to do this. We need other people. Let's work with other people. So we did a process of bringing in new members. And now we've got like our main founding family of 4 households. We're working on bringing in some new households. Basically, it's going to be about 8 to 10 families to start with. And again, I couldn't do it by myself, but together we come together and we make that happen. And we spend a lot of time on conflict resolution, decision making, doing the work that's necessary to build on that land. It wouldn't have happened without these other people. And I've seen other examples too, where people are like, look, I want to take my kids out of the state education system, but I'm a working class mom. I don't have time. I don't have, I have a little bit of money, this and that. Well, then they come together as a group of parents, and whether you call it pods or cells or groups or whatever, they start sharing the resources of, we're going to hire a tutor that we all think has the proper knowledge we want our kids to learn. And we're going to share those, those costs together. Like, it all comes back to us working and collaborating together. That's the key thing, because yes, exit and build is a big idea. It's a lot easier for people to just say, okay, Derrick, but I could just go press a vote and hope that everything works out. What you're saying, it requires time, sweat, blood, energy, tears, maybe changing my habits, maybe changing my lifestyles, working with people who have different opinions even. I know that's really scary for some people. And that sounds like a lot compared to just pressing a button and hoping somebody, and I get that, and I totally understand that. But the lie we've been sold is that freedom comes in some simple way. That there's going to be, because people will say that, okay, Derrick, that's great, but what's going to fix things now? Nothing's going to fix things now. Trump's not going to fix things now. Harris isn't going to fix things now. There is no get to freedom quick scheme. In fact, Konkin warned about that. He said, be wary of get liberty quick schemes, because they were going to include statism and voting and just all these other false narratives that we would be fed as things got worse, that people would just be corralled back and forth into that system.
On the other end of it, like, it requires a violent overthrow,
storm the Capitol or something, and we're going to win. Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for violence, apathy, or voting. It said it's like, but again, I do vote every single day with my actions and the way that I live my life as an example. And that's really what voluntarism comes down to, is that you can't force people to be free. We work through education, trying to share knowledge. We lead by example, I think, is the main thing, because people can't imagine what they can't see. And so you can have a lot of nice ideas and they sound good on paper, but if they don't see it in real life, then it's like, I don't even know if that's real, right? Unfortunately, we're visual creatures, right? So people have to see that something's possible. I think the work that I'm trying to participate, and there are so many other people around the world, I would say, I'm not claiming any sort of monopoly on this by any means, but those who are choosing to be forward thinking and take action, I do truly believe we are laying the foundation for whatever comes next. That I don't claim to know what that's even going to look like. I just know it's necessary. I just know if we don't start now, we can see what's coming. We know what else is coming. So it's either smart cities, 15-minute city, you own nothing and be happy, or whatever the heck we create. And that's what I really think it comes down to. Like, or you can try to sit in the middle for as long as you can and hope you're not going to get pulled into there. But again, you can be all awake, but if everything you have is dependent on their system, when from one day to the next, they turn your money into CBDCs, or they require you to have a digital ID to do anything, and you have no alternative, just like with COVID, you'll have to make hard choices. And I don't want to see more people do that. I don't want to see more good people. Well, I didn't prepare. I heard about this, but I just kept sitting still and thinking Trump was going to save it. And now here it is, and I'm no longer free. And I don't even know how to get out of the system anymore. There is hope that these folks in Denmark, even as it's progressing, they're still trying. It hasn't got to the point where they're just like, there's no way out. Like, we're totally screwed. But it definitely felt that way being there for us. And we had the feeling, just talking to each other, like, we can never let this happen.
Well,
like,
we can never let this happen. This is the whole point of, like, people will say something to the effect of, well, if you don't like this country, then go try another country. And it's like, this is the whole point. We don't want this land to end up like that land. So it is even more imperative right now that we speak and share these ideas and get people to focus on these solutions to exit and build, because we don't want to end up like that. We don't want to have to be forced with the hard decision of, like, dude, I literally don't know how to operate unless I'm in this. What do I do? That's the whole point of having this discussion, despite being in a, quote, freer place. I acknowledge that, fully acknowledge that it is much better here in terms of the liberty that is available than it is available in other places. But that's why it's even more imperative. And another point that you brought up is freedom and, like, this get liberty quick schemes, right? And the responsibility that's required, like this old cliche saying that really actually means something. With great freedom comes great responsibility. Like, it requires that you take ownership of your own shit. And like, how do I figure all this out in order to be truly free? Both internally, how do I own my own shit emotionally? How do I own my own belief systems? How do I not project on other people? And then expanding that into a community, into your family, et cetera, to be like, okay, how do we take full ownership of our own stuff and not rely on these systems? And again, there's a spectrum in between that. But if more people were focused on reevaluating their principles instead of going with what's pragmatic. And what I mean by that is like, okay, pragmatically, in order to make sure that it doesn't become more tyrannical, even though I disagree with Trump on this, and this, I'm going to vote for him because pragmatically it makes sense, even though it goes against my principles. If everyone just made a choice, even just in the freedom community, let's say even just a small subset of the freedom community, let's say 1 to 2 million people in the United States, 2 to 5 million people in the United States just decided that, no, I'm going to stick to my principles and I'm going to go with those. Meaning that when they show up to the airport like you do in another place, they're like, no, I'm not opting into this. There's so many people who are like, pragmatically, I should just do this, even though my principles tell me not to. And that's the problem, is people choose pragmatism over principles over and over and over again each day, to where we continue to slip down the slope of tyranny instead of standing on their principles. Because how much more effective do you think it would be if all the people who did not want to participate in the facial recognition, let's take that as an example, but this could apply to so many other things. I don't want to participate in facial recognition, so I'm not going to. I'm going to make a stand right now. And if 5 million people started doing it, be like, holy shit, this is causing a little bit of a ripple right here. That line would be a lot
longer.
That line would be a lot longer, but it would eventually get to a point where the airlines are now losing out on money because they're like, well, shit, this is all taking a lot longer, and that will force change outside of having to vote for the change or hope that some congressman
There's
or
so
senator.
many other ways you can affect change.
That's my whole point, man. And if more people would just do that, I think the same thing when it comes to COVID. And I know this sounds so simple that it's crazy, but it really is this simple. If everyone just had said, nope, I'm not doing that, which doesn't require belligerence, hostility, doesn't require you to petition, to do any of that stuff. Just like, no, thank you, not for me. If just the people who authentically did not want to participate just chose to stand on their own principles and not participate, there's nothing that they could have done. And what I mean by that more specifically is we can look at examples of where a local law firm, take as an example, all of them were told by, the CEO of that law firm, like, you must get the shot. And all of them came together and were like, you know what? Even though we're being threatened with this and we're all going to get fired possibly, let's all just band together and say no. And then what happens? That law firm, that CEO is like, well, fuck, I can't lose my people, so I'm going to go ahead and have to change this policy around. And that's the whole point. We forget our own individual power, especially when that individual power is pushed forth collectively. And that's where we really have to come together in community and rely on our brothers and sisters to our left and our right to do these things. Absolutely. To force change outside the system.
That's so important. I mean, it's just the classic ideas of non-compliance and nonviolent compliance. It does go a long way. And again, we've been taught to doubt ourselves and to doubt the power that we have within us. But thankfully we have people who've come before us to remind us that we're made up of the soil, we're made up of the stars and of the earth, and we actually have so much power within us when we choose to step up and use it. And you remind me, I'll just share briefly that when I was in Houston, when my activism was early, this is 2012. The Department of Homeland Security and the city of Houston had announced that they were going to start this program called Bus Safe, where they were going to start putting TSA officers on all the buses to ride the city buses.
Hell no.
And so we heard about this, and at the time, there was almost 15 years ago, there was a lot more resistance and pushback to the TSA and to the body scanners and all this stuff. There was like National Opt-Out Day, and there was more knowledge around this. So we were already kind of going to the airports, passing out flyers about the TSA. And then when this happened, we're like, oh, hell no, we're not letting this happen in our city. So the activist group I was a part of, the Houston Freethinkers, we rallied up some people together. We knew that Metro was going to be discussing this. That's the bus company at their next board meeting. So we were like, let's just show up en masse. Like, anybody, it's a public speaking, anybody, and they're used to like nobody being there. Well, we organized, a group of local lawyers showed up, the local media showed up, and we just hit them like one after the other, people saying like, I'm not going to ride anymore, from lawyers saying, please go through with this so I can sue you for violating the Fourth Amendment. And just hitting them up like with this. We didn't have to go to the city government. We went directly to the company that was partnering with the government on this. And they just said, we're overwhelmed. We really had no idea this is, they're so unpopular. We're going to set up another meeting in a week and a half to just specifically talk about this. So then we organized even further. We came back again. We got the media to come back, got even more people to show up. By the end of that meeting, they canceled the entire program. Yeah. It has never come back in the city of Houston. It's expanded in other cities, though. You can find in Boston, other places, TSAs on the subways, on bus lines, but they've never, up until this point, it's been over a decade, tried to bring that back to the city of Houston. And that to me is like one of my, like, as far as activism goes, like proudest moments of like, holy shit,
That's
we
incredible,
actually,
man.
we stopped that, you know? And I was, for me, it was personal because I ride the bus when I'm in the city, you know? So what they're basically saying is by buying a bus ticket, you automatically give up your Fourth Amendment to be free from search and seizure, because they were going to have drug sniffing dogs. They were going to have people boarding the flights and requesting ID checks and just all kinds of, you know, post 9/11 stop and frisk type stuff. And we were able to defeat that. We didn't have to petition. We didn't have to vote. We didn't, I mean, it can happen. And it does take time. It takes energy. It takes going out there, showing up. I mean, I would say 99% of any success I've had in any area of my life ever, but especially in the last 10 years with activism and journalism and this whole thing, is just from showing up.
Right.
Just literally showing up, being the person to be there, to ask the questions or to represent that viewpoint or to stand in defense of liberty or whatever it is. Like, you inspire other people, you know, then that ripples out and goes further. And, you know, there's one other point you made me think of as far as like I'm imagining, I like to try to preempt the critics, and I'm imagining people who are like, okay, exit and build, get land. I hear all that stuff, but we might have even touched on this earlier. The idea that you're going to be left alone. Like people are like, oh, you really think they're just going to leave you alone? I don't think we can count on them just being kind and necessarily leaving us alone forever per se. But I do think it's interesting to note in that original essay that came from the World Economic Forum in 2016 was published in Forbes magazine, Welcome to 2030, I Own Nothing and Life Has Never Been Better, that they describe all the scary things of like, oh, I used to own things, but now we just share them. And, you know, I used to have my own car, but it's so much easier not to. About a third of the way down, there's a section that says, sometimes I think about the people we left behind, the people who technology moved too fast for, the people who didn't like the political changes. They now live outside of the city in 19th century shanty towns and this and that. And that's us. Like, but it's not going to be some like dystopian Mad Max, or it doesn't have to be. It can be permaculture paradises and conscious communities and freedom neighborhoods and networks of people trading and doing these things. So even in this World Economic Forum members' dystopian vision of the future that they're trying to sell us on, they have some acknowledgement that there's going to be people who don't go along with it.
I've always intuitively thought that too, especially at this point in time. Like, just the way that I look at it, it seems to be as if, yes, they're aware, they're trying to censor people like us, they're trying to mess with us quite a bit, of course. But it seems to be that they're like, hey, this is your opportunity to totally opt out of this stuff if you want to, but this is like going to be the easiest point of exit, because once you go down this way, it's going to be really hard to exit our system. I really feel like this point in time is that. I
think we are at a crucial moment as far as that goes. I don't see how we can, I mean, even with the facial recognition thing as an example, like I totally agree with you. Like if more people, when Miriam and I opted out on the way in, it was with family, and I'd kind of told them ahead of time, like, hey, there's going to be a machine. Just, you know, I encourage you guys to say no. The guy got triggered. We did it on the way back though, and we had no issues. We just told them like, no, thank you. We just like to show our passport. There's no signs posted you can do this anyways, right? So then they say, okay, just go over to that line. 98% of the people are on this line with the facial recognition because they've also been trained by COVID. Put your feet on the ground and stand there. But we go to the other lane and it's just her and I. Literally, there's two border agents just sitting there like bored, doing nothing, and we're the only people like who even know that's an option. But if that line was filled up with everybody and it started to cause them delays, then these programs could be pushed back against. But if not, barring some massive movement of people waking up to realizing how far along facial recognition and these different surveillance tools, because they can't have the technocratic state without digital IDs and without facial recognition. That makes everything else that they're going to do work. Being able to track you everywhere you go, facial recognition is the way that China's done it, the way that India's done it, and Estonia and other countries that are voluntarily doing it. That is the way they will be able to do it. Without these systems in place, they can't fully have what they want. And these systems are being rolled out everywhere we go right now. They're already testing. You kind of touched on this earlier too. Like they're going to sell this to us in so many different ways. Convenience is the major way because most people just want whatever's convenient and easy. And so when they tell you, you don't even have to talk to a human anymore at the grocery store, you just connect to our app or whatever, scan your face. And as soon as you walk in the store, we'll scan your face, grab what you want, walk out, we'll automatically deduct it from your bank account because everything's integrated. It's so convenient, so easy. They're going to sell it on convenience, entertainment, of course, fear. This is the way to prevent fraud and this and that.
Well, and then on the right-leaning side of things, just real quick, just to touch back on
immigration.
That, they'll sell on that too. Like, oh, we can't figure out who any of these people are, so in order to defend against that,
a digital ID would solve voter fraud, wouldn't it? Like, and that's the whole thing: is the false binary is bringing both groups to the same destination. But Elon Musk's the good technocrat. He promises we need to merge with machines, but not for the reason they want to. It's for something else.
With millimeter wave technology, but no big deal.
Putting satellites around the entire planet looks a lot like the total information awareness program they tried to roll out after 9/11. So there's all those false binaries that are bringing people to the same place. And so if we don't find ways to stop them, which I wish and I work towards where we can, and I'm going to opt out and say no at every chance I get, and I encourage more people to do the same. But if that is not preventable, then we need to have some alternative plan other than just keep voting till, the end of the time and hoping something different. And that is why I put most of my energy into that, like parallel systems, exiting and build, trying to live as an example. Like I said, I'm not just talking about these ideas. We've got land, we're working towards it. And I don't claim to be fully out of the systems. I mean, I haven't used a bank account since 2008. I don't talk to the IRS. I don't have a driver's license. I only have a passport. There's decisions I've made, and life is already difficult in the current way we're at to sort of operate without that. If you don't have a credit rating score, or if you do, but it's horrible because I just don't pay attention, and for me, you add on top having a felony on my record, like I basically don't exist in these people's world because they'll ask you, let me see your tax record. Let me see your bank history. Let me see your paycheck stubs. Let me, all these things that are sort of not mandatory, but they're expected that all good, upstanding citizens have these sort of things. And if you don't have them, you basically don't exist, which I'm okay with right now.
Right.
But you see how the more integrated it gets, the harder it will be to do the things I'm talking about, like looking to Denmark and elsewhere. So that's why we really are at a crucial point. I can't tell other people what liberty looks like for them, but the more they understand what that means for them, then they know what they're aiming for. And they can decide, okay, I like what Derrick's saying, but it's a little extreme for me in this area. I don't care about, I'm going to keep using Google just as one example. I'm okay with that. But I will stop, I will opt out of facial recognition, right? You need to know what's best for you. I can't tell you. For me, I'm trying to avoid as much of it as possible. I use technological tools to the advantage that they are, recognize them as tools, but also am aware of the ways they can be used against me. And that's really a cat and mouse game when it comes to the big tech side of things, because we got privacy tools and they crack it, and then we got new ways. And so, but it's up to each individual and in family and community to come together and say, these are the things we're willing to put up with, and these are the things we're not willing to put up. If you don't know what your red line is in the sand is, you're going to keep being pushed. You're going to keep being pushed.
Drip,
and for
drip.
me, when COVID happened, we knew, I'd always, in my head, had said, like, if the state ever tries to restrict interstate travel, to me, that's a red line, because it's still a cage, So at the beginning of COVID, they start checking license plates from cars leaving New York City and Rhode Island. And I'm just like, okay, this doesn't feel good. And they start talking about closing the border. That's when we loaded up our car and went to go visit family in Mexico. Because for me, that's always been a red line in the sand. It wasn't about running away. It's like, look, I'm going to watch this from somewhere else. Right. Because even if the cage is the size of Texas, it's still a cage. I don't like knowing that I can't leave when I want to leave.
Exactly.
And that's a bad sign that things are going further. That was a red line for me. It's important for other people to know, what are those red lines for you? What are you not willing to put up? Because we've got Real ID being rolled out in the US. We got digital ID. Like, as of November 10th, the whole EU is requiring digital IDs for all foreigners to visit. There's these things are not 10 years down the line. These are 2024, 2025, 2026. And we don't need to give them power and assume that everything that they're working towards is magically going to happen on January 1st, 2030. But we should also, as you were saying earlier, be aware that that's their goal, that those are their agendas, and not just totally ignore that it's 2024 going on 2025, and these plans are marching forward.
Amen.
So what are we going to put our energy into over that time period?
Amen, man. So well said. So well said. This has been a freaking amazing conversation. This is exactly where I wanted to take it, to answer that question. Don't vote. Well, then what are we supposed to do? Don't vote. What's your solution? And like, we offered so many solutions here. And to sort of tie this up in a funny way, speaking of TSA, I've thought about this so much. I always opt out of the millimeter wave scanners at TSA. And what's really cool is other people will, like, as I'm standing there, and of course they take their time, they take like 20 to 30 minutes.
They're in no hurry.
Yeah, no hurry. Like, hey, I'm about to board my plane. They do not care because they get frustrated that you're opting out. But there's two things. The more that you can be kind with those TSA agents, despite them being rude to you, I've found that they can see you as a human being, and you see them as a human being. And yes, they're operating as agents of the state. But dude, I used to be an agent of the state. I went to the world's largest, most sophisticated government indoctrination camp there is, United States Military Academy at West Point. So my point is that if I can wake up after seeing a more attractive way, and for us that looked like having a really traumatic experience with my wife being sick, my mom being sick. But the point is, if I can wake up after seeing a more attractive way, so too can these people that are operating as agents of the state. If you just show them a more attractive way, if you actually embody that heart-centeredness, not in a woo-woo way, but in a very real way for them, and show them a more attractive way. Be that strong, coherent field that overtakes and trains weaker, incoherent fields. Be that strong point of awareness and show them a more attractive way of being. And then also, I always make a point to, when I'm standing there waiting and I see other people going through the millimeter wave scanners, is they'll ask like, why are you opting out? And then I'll just say, hey, actually, there's not really any studies indicating that that's safe for you, and we don't know the long-term effects of them. And I just really want to treat my body in a way that I respect my body, and so I'm not going to do this thing. And I just don't think this is a justifiable infringement upon my bodily sovereignty. And the overwhelming majority of people I talk to are like, oh, I'm going to have to look into that just by engaging with them in a very conscious way. And then the third thing that I'll propose, and this is a way that you can kind of make these opting out things fun. How funny would it be? This is going to be so off the wall, but you'll see where I'm going with this. If the people that decided to opt out, because there are enough of us that opt out now, just all decided one day, like, okay, if you're traveling today, opt out. And as TSA is doing the pat down, just kind of like softly moan each time.
I've seen
because
these
think about what that
before.
would cause. Like, dude, this is happening all over the country. To make it so awkward for them, they're like, dude, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, this is like not okay for me to do this.
You know, it's funny, over the years of opting out, I've tried a number of different tactics. For one, what you were saying there is so important, to try to meet these people where they are. And granted, I mean, some of these people are not friendly at all, and they clearly are miserable in their jobs and things like that. But barring that, like you said, there is a human being on the other side that is a potential mind and heart that could be reachable.
Amen.
If you approach it in a certain light. And I do think that's important. And man, I've seen over the years, like, so many people, like, for example, when you do opt out, for those who don't do it, they ask you, do you want to go do a private screening? And I always tell them, like, no, I want this to be out in the open. Like, I want people to see.
Right.
And for some people, they're like, yeah, this isn't, I always opt out, but I don't want to be groped in the process. Again, it's sad that that's the state of affairs, that you have to choose one or the other. But again, I do want to opt out of that. And like you said, that always presents an opportunity to educate other people around you. And we spent a lot of time back in the day going to the airport for those specific reasons, not even to fly, just showing up and passing out flyers to people there and saying, did you know this machine? And people are receptive to it. I think it's just, we have to see that there is still, like, we don't need to give up on people. I don't want that for anybody to take that as well, because I sometimes see, again, in the black-pilled crowd, but also maybe in other areas, of people who just think like, screw the normies, or whatever term they want to use, the sheeple or whatever. I don't feel that way. I very much, for whatever reason, like the way that I've manifested here, and the role that I think I'm supposed to play is, living as an example, trying to work on solutions that I think are valuable, and then using journalism and using, the research to reach new people who are just starting their journey. So it's kind of like, maybe they watch a documentary, they read an article or a book or something that I've been involved with, and then that kind of gets a light bulb in their head. Then they start looking for answers, and we give them a hand and say, hey, come over here and see what we're building. Like, come bring your skills and your knowledge. You sort of said this earlier. I really do think everything we already need is within our communities. And I mean that, like, the broader freedom community around the world, but also your local community. Like, when you get networked and you start meeting other people, you do realize that you have the other piece of the puzzle I've been looking for. And I know somebody who can help you out in this way. And the more we pull those resources and that network together, we do have so much potential. And so, even when it comes to the Henry Kissingers and the Bill Gates of the world, barring them potentially being some non-human entity, for what we know, they are human beings. And even being able to empathize with them and to see that for whatever reason, their role is to be whatever you want to call they're doing, right? Because if they weren't there doing their things, we never would have woke up in the first place.
Would you have actually enacted your whole developing the conscious Agora community? Would you have done that if it wasn't for this COVID situation?
And that's the thing, is, like, if there wasn't things to wake up from 15 years ago when somebody handed me a flyer about 9/11 and there was something to research, if that thing didn't exist and these, what we could call evil people or whatever we want to call them, weren't doing what they are, for whatever reason that I don't claim to fully understand, the role they are here to play, whether that's the yin and the yang, and we're just opposing forces and they're playing their role and we're playing ours. At the end of the day, being able to even humanize them and say, like, look, as weird as it may sound, Henry Kissinger, Klaus Schwab, this is somebody's grandpa. Think about that. There's some little kid that runs up and is like, Grampy Klaus, and jumps on his lap and, and sees him like the best thing in the world. Yet they are making decisions that do cause harm and do things. We shouldn't ignore those as well. But really, even being able to take yourself to that place and see the other human being in there. And like you said, we could just look at TSA people, they're agents of the state, screw them, and trust me, I've been there. I have all kinds of issues with cops and with authority and people who misuse and abuse that authority. Like we saw at the airport, somebody's ego was hurt. And so they wanted to harass us for 4.5 hours. But it's not always going to be that way. And if we strive to stay in that heart space that you're talking about and trying to reach people and not giving up on our brothers and sisters. And I can come off rough to people, like the best of them, especially on social media. I tend to call it blunt compassion because I think sometimes people need some of that. Right. But also I'm not in charge of their journey and I can't, control that, as frustrating as it might be. I have to let go of my own internal need to want to be in control and just plant the seeds that I can plant, and then trust the rest and do what I can and lead by example. That's all we really can do. We can't force people to be free. Voting people to try to force people to be free through your favorite tyrant because he's slightly better than the other person or less bad in some areas, I don't think it's a winning strategy. But if people feel inclined to do that as we approach this election, I highly, highly encourage them to do these other things. And I just want to end with saying that I've actually been doing on my website, and people can find this after, for the days to come, leading up to the election, what I've called the 45-day exit and build challenge. So we're on week 6 this week as we're recording. The final week will be the next Friday right before the election. And just going through these different areas. We started with food, then money, then technology, then education and knowledge. Last week, we also talked about land. This coming week's on mindset, because also we have to exit from unhealthy mindsets and limiting beliefs. And then the final week will be about applying these whole ideas holistically.
Amen.
So
Wow.
be above and beyond the election, that will be at my website, theconsciousresistance.com. People can go search exit and build. And I just encourage anybody, whenever you're hearing this, start that challenge. Take these ideas seriously week by week and just see what comes out of it. Like every week, I sort of give people homework, like go visit a farmer's market, talk to the people who are growing food near you, talk to the people producing working with the chickens that are giving you those eggs, develop personal relationships with them. And I truly believe if people take the challenge and these ideas serious and actually apply them, they will see the difference between just voting and doing nothing. So I just want to encourage people to actually take action. I wish that we were on a path in a timeline where things were going to be easily handed to us, but I don't think that's where we're at. I think we have to work for this freedom if we want to keep it alive.
Amen. And it's worth it for the generations
Absolutely.
before us and the generations
100%.
after us. And the last thing that I'll say, just to add to what you said about the looking at people like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab and humanizing them, it's so important, because ultimately the way that I've come to look at it is those are people who are disconnected from or have forgotten the inherent connection to God, source, energy, whatever you want to call it within them, and they just deny that aspect of themselves. And again, the more that we represent that strong, coherent field, we can overtake and entrain weaker, incoherent fields. That's the principle of electromagnetism, right? And then the other thing about putting them back in the category of human being, putting Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or anyone that you want to call a tyrant back into the category of human being, and I agree that they're acting tyrannical, is that, whoa, I'm a man, they're a man, they're a woman, they're no different than me. So what gives them the right to do these things? It's bringing it back to, they're just men and women who call themselves this specific title. But at the end of the day, pending that they're not some other entity, like you said, they're just men or women. And ultimately, I'm a man too. And I have my own inherent power and my own inherent authority in here. And I don't have to buy into that. And the more that we can get a collective of people to understand that and adopt these principles, changing their foundational belief systems, the more that their actions will lead us away from the technocratic state and more towards a path that is harmonious for all people. So that's what we're doing here with this conversation. And then the last thing that I'll end with is that even if you didn't listen to the second half of this show, and I hope you did, ultimately, what we talked about earlier, falsification does not require replacement. Just by pointing out the inherent problems, that in and of itself can act as a solution for someone. And you can't know what solutions are possible unless you know the true foundational problems, which is why we give that context sometimes. And again, not to be consumed by them, but just to be aware that, hey, this is a false dilemma that a lot of people in the freedom movement are engaging with. So we want to point out this false dilemma and then show you the options outside this false dilemma so that you can step into your own power and really take ownership of your own life, which is a fundamental part of voluntarism. So, dude, again, I know we've had our differences, and I apologize for the way that I've behaved in some ways with that too. But I really, really appreciate this conversation at this point in time. I think it's so incredibly important. And I really appreciate you sitting down with me for this.
Hey, we're all learning and growing, brother, and I'm happy to be on this with you.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much.